The smell of splintered pine, wet wool, and drying blood hung heavy in the suffocating air of the makeshift clinic. Beyond the frosted glass of the apothecary window, an early autumn blizzard howled down from the jagged peaks, rattling the loose floorboards and screaming through the eaves. Evangeline sat utterly motionless on the edge of a narrow canvas cot, her breath pluming in the freezing draft. Her dark charcoal morning dress hung in damp, frayed ribbons around her narrow shoulders, stained with the mud of the ravine where the stagecoach lay shattered. She was the sole survivor. There is a kind of cold that sinks past the freezing flesh, past the aching bone, and settles directly into the soul. It is the chill of being entirely alone in a brutal, unforgiving world. As we settle by the fire to walk this bitter trail together, Moat invite you to linger a while, subscribe to this gathering of stories, and perhaps share your own thoughts in the comments about what true resilience looks like. Sometimes, the most unbreakable iron is forged in the quietest hearts. Evangeline's pale, porcelain skin was marred by a stark purple bruise along her left cheekbone. Her unruly auburn hair, usually pinned in a neat, respectable coil, hung in damp, tangled waves around her face. Her hazel eyes, wide and hollowed by a grief too vast to name, remained fixed on the scarred wooden floor. She shivered violently, her slender arms crossed tight over her chest, yet not a single tear fell. She had no tears left. Across the cramped room, the town's physician wiped a blood-stained scalpel with a dirty rag, keeping his voice lowered in a futile attempt at discretion. Beside him stood the local magistrate, a stout man with a pocket watch chained to his vest and a permanent scowl of inconvenience etched into his features. "We cannot keep her here," the magistrate muttered, casting a fleeting, dismissive glance at Evangeline. "The town coffers are stretched thin as it is. We have no funds for indigent widows, let alone one half dead from a coach wreck. The workhouse in the valley is full. She would not survive the journey back down to the valley anyway." The physician grumbled, tossing the rag onto a tin tray. "Look at her. She is skin and grief. Her lungs rattle with the damp. The first deep frost will take her, and then Moat will be left to pay the undertaker out of my own pocket." Evangeline heard every word. Her chapped lips parted as a desperate defense rose in her throat, a plea for a chance to work, to prove her worth, but a harsh cough violently seized her chest instead. She pressed a trembling, dirt-streaked hand over her mouth, forcing her spine completely straight. She would not beg. Her late husband had left her with oceans of debt and a fractured spirit, but he had not managed to take her dignity. Then, the heavy iron latch of the clinic door lifted with a sharp, metallic clack. The heavy oak door swung inward, violently driven by the gale outside. A swirl of white snow violently invaded the room, accompanied by the towering, massive silhouette of a man who seemed entirely carved from the mountain itself. Thaddeus stepped over the threshold, pulling the heavy door shut behind him, with an effortless heave that silenced the howling wind. He stood well over 6 feet, heavily muscled and broad-shouldered beneath a heavy fur-lined canvas coat. A faded red flannel shirt peeked from beneath thick leather suspenders, dusting with fresh snow. His face was a landscape of weathered, rugged terrain, framed by a thick, dark brown beard and marked by a pale, jagged scar that slashed across his left jawline. But it was his eyes that commanded the room. They were piercing, watchful steel blue, carrying the heavy, solitary silence of the high timberlines. "Thaddeus," the magistrate breathed, instinctively taking a step backward. "You did not send word you were riding down from the camp." "Storm brought the deadline forward," Thaddeus rumbled. His voice was a deep, resonant baritone that vibrated in the tight confines of the room. Slow and deliberate. "Need my winter supplies. And the ledger keeper you promised." The magistrate nervously rubbed the back of his neck. "Ah, yes. Well, the boy we hired took one look at the clouds, gathering over the peaks, and caught the first train eastward. Moat have no one else who can decipher a banking ledger, Thaddeus. The logging camp will have to manage its own books this season." Thaddeus's jaw tightened, a subtle shift in the scarred terrain of his face. He ran a massive, calloused hand over his beard, his steel blue gaze sweeping the room. He needed a keeper. The timber syndicate in the valley was ruthless, and a single misplaced decimal point in the Season S haul meant ruin for the men, depending on him. His eyes stopped on the cot in the corner. Evangeline looked up. For a fleeting second, the heavy, chaotic noise of the storm outside seemed to fade into absolute stillness. She saw the immense physical power of the man, the rough-spun trousers and the worn leather work boots. But beyond the terrifying exterior, she felt an inexplicable, grounding weight in his gaze. He did not look at her with the irritating pity of the physician, nor the resentful burden of the magistrate. He looked at her as if he were trying to read the weather in her hazel eyes. Her, Thaddeus stated quietly. The physician nearly dropped his tray. Her? With be reasonable. Man. That is a survivor from the ravine crash. She is a destitute widow. Can she read a ledger? Thaddeus asked, his gaze never leaving Evangeline's face. Evangeline swallowed the dry, stinging pain in her throat. She gripped the frayed lace of her collar, forcing her voice steady. Moat managed the accounts of a merchant house for 5 years, she whispered, her voice raspy but entirely resolute. Moat am perfectly capable of keeping a ledger. The magistrate let out a sharp, mocking laugh. Thaddeus, do not be absurd. Your camp sits at an elevation where the snow buries the windows by December. It is a brutal, savage place for hardened men. You need a strong worker, not a fragile doll. Thaddeus finally broke his gaze away from Evangeline, turning his towering frame toward the magistrate. The sheer, intimidating mass of his presence seemed to suck the oxygen from the room. He stepped forward, his heavy boots thudding against the floorboards, like the strikes of a blacksmith's hammer. Won't need her, Thaddeus replied. There was no room for argument in his tone. It was a finalized decree, spoken with the absolute authority of a man who governed the high peaks. Before the magistrate could stammer another protest, Thaddeus turned his back on the town officials. He walked slowly toward Evangeline's cot. She instinctively pressed herself back against the wall, her breath hitching as his massive shadow enveloped her. Her whole life had taught her that men of such size brought only violence and demands. Instead, Thaddeus reached up and unfastened the heavy brass toggles of his massive fur-lined canvas coat. He slipped it from her broad shoulders, holding the immense garment in his thick, scarred hands. With slow, deliberate gentleness, as if terrified his rough hands might shatter her, he draped the heavy coat over Evangeline's trembling shoulders. The sheer weight of the garment immediately grounded her. It smelled intensely of cedar sap, horsehair, and the clean, biting scent of fresh snow. A sudden, overwhelming surge of warmth rushed into her freezing bones, bringing a flush of color back to her pale cheeks. Thank you, she breathed, her fingers rising to grasp the thick lapels of the coat. We ride in 10 minutes, Thaddeus murmured, his voice softening just a fraction, exclusively for her ears. He gave her a single, reassuring nod, ensuring she had the moment she needed to gather whatever shattered pieces of herself remained. Evangeline nodded, forcing her trembling legs to bear her weight as she stood from the cot. The oversized coat swallowed her delicate frame entirely, dragging heavily against the floor. But as she moved to follow him toward the door, she suddenly stopped, pivoting back toward the blood-stained cot. With desperate, white-knuckled intensity, she reached down beneath the frame of the bed and dragged out a heavy, iron-bound wooden box. It was scarred by the crash, secured with a massive brass padlock, and entirely too heavy for her fragile, weakened state. Thaddeus paused at the door, watching her struggle to lift the cumbersome object by its leather handle. He took a single stride back, reaching out a massive hand to take the burden from her. Allow me, he rumbled gently. Evangeline violently recoiled, her hazel eyes flashing with sudden, sheer terror. She dragged the heavy wooden box flush against her chest, wrapping both arms around the iron bindings, despite the agonizing pain in her battered ribs. She held it as a drowning woman holds a piece of driftwood. Thaddeus instantly froze. He read the wild, hunted panic in her posture and immediately stepped back, lowering his hands to his sides to show he meant no threat. "Keep it," Thaddeus murmured, his steel blue eyes narrowing slightly in quiet, intense observation. He turned and pushed the clinic door open against the howling wind, leading the way out into the blinding white fury of the street. Evangeline followed, carrying the crushing weight of the box against her heart. Thaddeus stepped out into the freeze, his mind churning with the silent question of what could possibly be hidden inside that heavy iron lockbox, something she clearly valued far more than her own survival. The world beyond the clinic door was a violently swirling canvas of blinding white. The biting gale instantly stripped the warmth from Evangeline's face, stinging her cheeks. "Ve capite hat," microscopic daggers of ice. Thaddeus wasted no time, moving with the fluid, practiced efficiency of a man who had spent a lifetime outsmarting the brutal elements. He led her to a pair of massive, sturdy draft horses tethered to the hitching post. Their thick winter coats were already dusted with snow, their breaths pluming in massive clouds of steam. Without a single word, Thaddeus took hold of the heavy iron-bound box she clutched to her chest. For a terrifying second, Evangeline's fingers locked tighter around the leather handle, a surge of pure panic widening her hazel eyes. She expected him to wrench it away. Men of power always took what they wanted. But Thaddeus simply waited. He did not pull, he did not force her. He merely held the immense weight of the box from the bottom, offering a faint promise of support, until her frozen fingers finally, reluctantly, uncurled. He strapped the locked crate securely to the saddlebags of the towering dapple-gray gelding, checking the leather ties twice. Then, he turned back to her. Towering over her delicate frame, he offered his massive, calloused hands. Taking a shuddering breath, Evangeline placed her boot in the stirrup. With an effortless heave that felt more like a gentle updraft than a physical lift, Thaddeus hoisted her into the saddle. He adjusted the heavy canvas coat, still draped around her, pulling the thick fur collar high to shield her bruised cheek from the stinging wind. "Keep your head down," Thaddeus murmured, his deep baritone barely carrying over the howling storm. "Trust the horse. He knows the trail." The ascent into the high timberlines began. The rhythmic, heavy crunch of massive hooves breaking through the frozen crust of the snow became the only sound in a world devoid of color. The trail was little more than a treacherous, winding ribbon of ice, carved into the steep granite cliffs. On one side, the jagged face of the mountain rose into the whiteout. On the other, a sheer, terrifying drop into the shadowed abyss of the ravine. The mountain is an honest and unforgiving judge of character. Up where the air grows thin and the cold snaps the sap in the pines, pretenses burn away. A soul cannot lie to the timberline. Thaddeus rode in the lead, his broad shoulders cutting a path through the dense, swirling snow. Every few minutes, his gloved hand would rise to unconsciously trace the pale, jagged scar along his jawline. A quiet, recurring habit whenever the weight of the mountain pressed heavy on his mind. He had expected the magistrate to be right. He had expected the fragile doll-like widow to break before they cleared the first ridge. Valley folk always did. They wept. They cursed the cold. They begged to turn back when the sheer terror of the altitude set in. Thaddeus had spent years retreating from the fragile nature of people, retreating into the silent brutality of the peaks because the trees, at least, knew how to stand their ground. He knew the devastating cost of weakness. The avalanche that had stolen his younger brother all those years ago had taught him that the mountain offered no mercy to those who faltered. Yet, as he subtly shifted his broad shoulders to glance back at the rider behind him, Thaddeus saw nothing of the weakness he anticipated. Evangeline sat perfectly upright in the saddle. Her slender hands gripped the pommel with white-knuckled determination. The massive canvas coat swallowed her completely, but beneath the heavy folds, her posture was rigid with a defiant, quiet strength. Her hazel eyes were focused dead ahead on the broad expanse of his back. She did not weep. She did not complain. Every time the heavy draft horse slipped on an icy stone, jarring her painfully bruised ribs, she simply clamped her chapped lips tighter, her jaw setting in a line of absolute, unbroken endurance. A profound, quiet revelation washed over Thaddeus. The magistrate had looked at her slender frame and seen a porcelain ornament ready to shatter. But Thaddeus watched the steady, rhythmic rise and fall of her shoulders, realizing the truth. Her strength was not the loud, boasting bravado of the loggers he commanded. It was the terrifying, silent resilience of water, slowly carving its way through solid stone. She was surviving on sheer will alone. The wind suddenly shifted, howling down the canyon with renewed fury. The crosswind threatened to push Evangeline's horse toward the treacherous edge of the cliff. Instantly, Thaddeus halted his mount. He violently hauled the reins, guiding his immense draft horse backward until he successfully positioned his mount directly between Evangeline and the deadly drop-off. He became a living, breathing barricade. His massive frame caught the brunt of the freezing gale, creating a pocket of still, protected air around her delicate figure. He held his horse steady, leaning into the wind until the worst of the squall passed over them. It was a profound, instinctual act of shelter. Evangeline blinked against the snow, her breath hitching as she stared at the broad expanse of his back. No one had ever stepped between her and a storm before. Her late husband had always been the one to push her into the harsh winds of his own making, hiding behind her respectable image, while his debts multiplied. The trail leveled out slightly into a dense, sheltered grove of ancient blue spruces. Thaddeus dismounted, his boots sinking deep into the powder. He walked back to her horse, his piercing steel blue eyes assessing the dangerous pallor of her skin. The bruise on her cheek stood out in stark, terrifying contrast to the bloodless white of her face. Wordlessly, he reached into his saddlebag and withdrew a heavy, dry wool blanket. He stepped close to her stirrup. The sheer proximity of him was overwhelming, yet entirely absent of malice. With gentle, meticulous care, he draped the heavy wool over her lap, tucking the edges tightly around her freezing legs to seal in the warmth. His thick, calloused knuckles brushed lightly against her trembling knee, a fleeting touch that sent an unexpected grounding jolt of warmth straight through the heavy layers of her clothing. "Drink," Thaddeus commanded softly. He unstoppered a tin canteen and offered it up to her. His scarred hands dwarfed the metal container. Evangeline reached down, her numb fingers clumsily wrapping around the cold tin. She struggled to lift it, her battered wrists screaming in protest. Without a flicker of impatience, Thaddeus simply wrapped his large hand over hers, guiding the canteen to her lips to steady the shaking. The lukewarm, bitter pine needle tea hit the back of her throat, radiating a small, precious beacon of heat into her hollow chest. She drank greedily, her eyes fluttering shut in sheer relief. "Thank you," she whispered, handing the canteen back. Her voice was barely a thread of sound. "2 more miles," Thaddeus rumbled, his gaze lingering on her face a second longer than necessary. He remounted, and the grueling ascent resumed. But the brief respite was not enough to combat the creeping lethargy of the deep freeze. As the elevation climbed, the air thinned. The exhaustion of the stagecoach crash, combined with the crushing despair of the past week, finally breached the walls of Evangeline's iron will. The cold stopped stinging, and began to feel deceptively, dangerously warm. The edges of her vision blurred, fading into a hazy vignette of gray shadows. The rhythmic swaying of the saddle became a hypnotic lullaby, pulling her into darkness. She slumped forward, her cheek pressing against the icy mane of the draft horse. Thaddeus pintered the subtle shift in the saddle leathers. He twisted around just in time to see her slender frame tilt dangerously to the left, her grip slipping entirely from the pommel. He vaulted from his horse before it had even fully stopped. Plunging through the waist-deep snowdrifts, Thaddeus caught her just as she fell from the towering height of the saddle. He absorbed the impact with his chest, his massive arms wrapping securely around her delicate waist, pulling her flush against his solid warmth. She weighed nothing. She felt entirely like hollow bird bones wrapped in a heavy canvas shell. Evangeline, Thaddeus breathed, using her name for the first time. The rough edge of panic bled into his usually stoic voice. He lowered her gently to the shelter of a massive pine trunk, shielding her body from the wind with his own. Her head lolled against his chest, her eyes half open but glazed over, completely untethered from reality. The terrifying flush of hypothermic fever burned bright on her pale cheeks. She stared right through him, seeing the ghosts of the valley she had tried so desperately to leave behind. Her small, trembling hands balled into fists, weakly hitting against his heavy coat as a desperate, hunted look seized her delicate features. "Please," Evangeline whispered, her voice a broken, hollow rasp entirely stripped of its dignity. A single, hot tear finally escaped her lashes, freezing as it tracked over the dark bruise on her cheek. "Mort, I'm sorry. Mort, I'm so sorry. Please, do not sell it." The massive spruce doors of the main camp lodge burst open, admitting a violent swirl of snow and the towering, snow-caked figure of the foreman. Inside, the chaotic, deafening roar of 30 hardened lumbermen instantly evaporated into dead silence. Men froze mid-laugh, tin cups of cheap whiskey halting halfway to their mouths. Thaddeus ignored them all. He strode directly through the center of the cavernous, smoke-filled hall, moving with an aggressive, protective urgency. Cradled against his massive chest, entirely swallowed by his fur-lined canvas coat, Evangeline lay utterly limp. He did not relinquish his burden to the camp cook, who rushed forward with a blanket. He carried her straight to the massive stone hearth, roaring at the far end of the room. With painstaking care, he lowered her onto the foreman's heavy leather chair directly before the flames, acting as a human shield between her fragile form and the staring, rough-hewn men. "Boil water," Thaddeus commanded, his deep baritone cutting through the stagnant air. "Fetch the heavy furs from my quarters. And put her iron box right by her feet." For 2 days, time blurred into a hazy, suffocating fever. Evangeline drifted in and out of consciousness, haunted by the crushing weight of snow and the phantom voice of her late husband demanding more time, more money, more lies. Yet every time the terror peaked, a rough, calloused hand would gently press a cool, damp cloth to her forehead, anchoring her back to reality. She would blink her eyes open to see the puck-light dancing across the towering silhouette of the mountain man, standing silent vigil over her chair. When the fever finally broke on the 3rd morning, the brutal exhaustion was replaced by a quiet, desperate need for purpose. She was entirely out of her element in this high-altitude fortress of sweat, sawdust, and rough men, but she refused to be a burden. Dignity was the only currency she had left. Wrapping a heavy wool shawl tightly around her narrow shoulders, she stepped out of the small, partitioned alcove Thaddeus had surrendered to her. The lodge was mostly empty, the men out on the timberline, save for 3 large loggers huddled around a massive oak table near the windows. The air was thick with the bitter scent of burnt coffee and wet pine. At the center of the table sat an open, leather-bound ledger. A burly logger with a thick, tangled red beard slapped his massive hand against the paper, his face flushed with furious frustration. "Mort, I'm telling you, Garrick, the syndicate is robbing us blind," the red-bearded logger bellowed, jabbing a thick, dirt-caked finger at the columns of ink. "We hauled 400 tons of premium blue spruce down that mountain last month. The rail yard receipt says we did. But the Valley Bank's draft is short by 30%. We cannot afford winter provisions on this." Garrick, a sharply featured man with a permanent scowl, aggressively rubbed his temples. "Mort know how to swing an axe, Silas. Mort do not know how to read the Valley Banker's sleight of hand. The numbers change columns. The tariffs are deducted twice, and the bottom line is what they say it is. We are trapped." Evangeline drifted closer, her footsteps entirely silent against the rough floorboards. She recognized the crushing, suffocating tone in Garrick's voice. It was the sound of a man drowning in a language he did not understand, the language of debt. Her late husband had wielded that language like a blade, carving away her peace of mind until there was nothing left but ruined credit. and whispered threats. The pain of those years. But the survival of it had honed her mind into a razor-sharp instrument. "May Moat see the page?" Evangeline asked quietly. The three men jumped, whirling around to face her. Silas, the red-bearded logger, looked her up and down with open, mocking disbelief. He took in her delicate frame, her pale porcelain skin, and the fading purple bruise on her cheek. "Go back to the fire, little bird," Silas sneered, waving his hand as if shooing away a nuisance. "This is a logging camp. We do not need a fragile glass doll playing with the books. Go knit something." The insult stung, echoing the magistrate's cruel words in the clinic. But Evangeline did not flinch. She simply straightened her spine. The terrible suffering she had endured in the valley had burned away her fear of boorish men. "You are being charged a phantom transport tariff," Evangeline stated, her voice steady and chillingly calm. She stepped right up to the table. Ignoring their towering, intimidating statures, she pointed a slender, trembling finger directly at the third column of the Valley Bank's drafted invoice. "Here, the syndicate is applying a 20% freight deduction before calculating the gross yield. But according to your own rail yard receipt, you prepaid the freight in raw timber." Garrick blinked, staring blankly at the numbers. "What does that mean?" "It means they are charging you for the train, and then deducting the cost of the train from your total profit a second time," Evangeline explained, her hazel eyes lighting up with sharp, analytical fire. "It is a deliberate, obfuscated ledger trap. Give me a pen." Without waiting for permission, she reached across the table and pulled the inkwell closer. She took the heavy steel-nibbed pen, her delicate hand moving with swift, brilliant precision. The scratch of the nib against the heavy parchment filled the quiet room. In less than 2 minutes, she reorganized the entire month's yield, cross-referencing the scattered receipts and isolating the exact mathematical deception the syndicate had buried in the margins. When she finally set the pen down, she slid the newly drafted page toward Garrick. "Take this to the magistrate, courier," Evangeline murmured, stepping back and pulling her shawl tighter. "Under the federal logging statutes of the territory, a duplicated tariff voids the entire banking draft. They owe you the 30%, plus a punitive late fee for the gross miscalculation. You will have your winter provisions." The loggers stared at the impeccably perfect handwriting, the flawlessly aligned columns, and the undeniable proof of the syndicate's theft. The mocking sneer completely vanished from Silas's face, replaced by stunned, open-mouthed awe. From the shadowed doorway of the lodge, a deep, resonant rumble of approval vibrated through the air. Thaddeus stepped into the light. He had been watching the entire exchange in silence. His massive chest rose and fell in a slow, steady rhythm, his piercing steel blue eyes locked entirely on Evangeline. The loggers instantly parted, stepping back in absolute deference as their foreman approached the table. Thaddeus looked down at the brilliantly corrected ledger, then back up to the delicate, fragile widow who had just saved his camp from starvation. His calloused fingers slowly rose, tracing the pale, jagged scar along his jawline. The quiet, recurring tale of a man whose entire worldview had been fundamentally altered. He had brought her up the mountain out of a rigid sense of duty, assuming she was a broken thing needing shelter. But looking at the fierce, unyielding intellect in her hazel eyes, the respect that bloomed in his chest was absolute. Without a word, Thaddeus reached out and pulled the heavy, oversized leather chair from the head of the table. He positioned it perfectly in front of the ledger, adjusting the brass oil lamp to cast a warmer, clearer light over the pages. It was a silent, profound gesture of validation. He was surrendering the financial helm of his camp to her. "Get to work," Thaddeus rumbled, his voice carrying a protective warmth that washed over her like the heat of the hearth. Evangeline felt a sudden, unfamiliar prickle of tears in her eyes, not from sorrow, but from the overwhelming, startling realization of being valued. She sat down, her fingers brushing the smooth leather of the book, feeling a profound, terrifying sense of emotional safety begin to take root in the frozen earth of her heart. Later that evening, the lodge filled with the boisterous noise of returning men. Evangeline had retired to her alcove, leaving the tidy stack of ledgers on the table. Silas, lingering behind the others, reached over to close the heavy book. As he did, a small, loose scrap of paper slipped from the binding and fluttered to the floor. Silas stooped to pick it up. It was a personal promissory note Evangeline had mistakenly used as a bookmark, bearing the ornate, wax-sealed signature of her late husband, Elias Vance. Silas froze. His eyes narrowed, darting toward the closed curtain of Evangeline's alcove. He crushed the paper in his thick fist, a cruel, calculating shadow crossing his weathered face. Vance, Silas whispered to himself, the noise of the crowded room masking his treacherous tone. Moat saw that name on a bounty poster down in the valley. $1,000 reward for the surviving widow. The mountain does not warn a man when it changes its mind. One moment, the high peaks bask in the deceptive, brittle sunlight of late autumn. The next, the sky turns the color of bruised iron, and the air pressure plummets with a physical weight that makes the ears ache. True courage, out here on the edge of the world, is not found in the absence of fear. True courage is the quiet, terrifying choice to stand fast when every instinct screams at you to run. By mid-morning, the wind began to scream through the high pines. Inside the lodge, the heavy timbers groaned under the shifting atmospheric pressure. Evangeline sat at the long oak table, her delicate fingers turning the pages of the camp ledger. The chaotic mess of numbers had surrendered to her meticulous, logical mind. Yet her hazel eyes kept drifting to the massive frosted windows. Beyond the glass, the tree line was already vanishing into a furious, churning wall of white. Thaddeus stood near the heavy oak doors, wrapping a thick length of coiled rope over his broad shoulder. He was fully geared for the freeze, his massive frame imposing beneath the heavy fur-lined canvas coat. He paused, his thick fingers rising to unconsciously trace the pale, jagged scar along his jawline. A crucial suspension cable on the upper ridge had snapped under the weight of the incoming ice. If the bundled timber up there broke loose, it would avalanche directly through the lower camp. He had to go out into the teeth of the storm. Thaddeus turned his head, his piercing steel blue eyes finding Evangeline across the vast, shadowed room. He did not issue a barrage of panicked instructions. He simply held her gaze, offering a steady, grounding anchor of absolute trust. Keep the hearth burning, Thaddeus rumbled, his deep baritone cutting through the howling drafts, rattling the shutters. Be careful, Evangeline breathed, her voice a fragile wisp that nonetheless carried the full, terrifying weight of her sudden, acute fear for his life. Thaddeus gave a single, firm nod. He pulled the heavy scarf over his face and pushed out into the whiteout, throwing his entire, massive weight against the violently thrashing door to pull it shut behind him. The moment the iron latch fell, the storm descended upon the camp with apocalyptic fury. The lodge violently shuddered, the floorboards vibrating beneath Evangeline's worn leather boots. A deafening crack echoed from the eastern slope, followed by the chaotic, muffled shouting of men caught off guard. The front door burst open again, admitting a blinding horizontal sheet of snow. Silas and Garrick stumbled inside, their faces red with panic and cold. The wind tore the roof off the southern supply shed. Silas bellowed, violently coughing as he slammed the door shut. The feed is exposed, and the draft horses are breaking their tethers in the stable. Where is the foreman? Garrick demanded, wildly scanning the room. He is on the upper ridge, Evangeline answered, instantly standing up from the ledger. Panic seized the loggers. Without their towering foreman to anchor them, the hardened men floundered. The sheer noise of the blizzard was paralyzing. Another terrifying shudder rolled through the lodge walls, shaking a layer of dust from the rafters. The heavy wooden storm shutters on the western windows began to tear loose from their iron hinges, violently slamming against the outer logs. Evangeline felt the familiar, suffocating grip of terror rising in her throat. Her entire life in the valley had been defined by shrinking away from conflict, hiding behind closed doors while disaster struck. But as she looked around the chaotic room, a profound realization anchored her to the floorboards. This was not the valley. This was the mountain. And this lodge was the sanctuary of the man who had wrapped his heavy coat around her freezing shoulders when the rest of the world had left her to die. She refused to let his home be destroyed. Evangeline stepped away from the table, her spine snapping entirely straight. She pulled her dark charcoal mourning shawl tight around her narrow shoulders, her hazel eyes flashing with a sudden, fierce, analytical fire. "Garrick," Evangeline commanded, her voice ringing out with astonishing, crystal-clear authority that sliced cleanly through the panic. "Take 3 men and secure the western shutters. Use the heavy iron spikes from the hearth box. Do not try to latch them. Nail them directly to the outer logs." Garrick blinked, momentarily stunned by the unyielding iron in the delicate widow's tone. "Silas," she continued, pivoting toward the massive red-bearded logger, locking eyes with him. She did not flinch. "Leave the supply shed. The feed is already lost, but the horses cannot be replaced. String a guide rope from the stable to the main lodge. Bring all the draft horses inside the eastern annex. Now, move." The absolute certainty in her voice acted as a physical tether. Silas and Garrick exchanged one wide-eyed look, then immediately sprang into action, driven by her unshakable command. For the next 2 hours, the camp was a battleground. Evangeline did not retreat to the safety of her alcove. She moved continuously through the freezing, chaotic lodge, a quiet, indomitable spirit orchestrating their survival. She ordered the men to bank the central furnace to prevent the pipes from bursting. She directed the relocation of the vital medical supplies away from the leaking roof. She organized a rotating watch by the heavy doors, ensuring no man went out into the blinding whiteout without a tether. By the time the violent peak of the squall finally broke, leaving behind a heavy, suffocating snowfall, the lodge was entirely secured. The horses were safely sheltered in the annex. The windows were nailed shut against the wind, and the men sat exhausted but safe around the roaring central hearth. Evangeline stood near the fire, her chest heaving. A smudge of dark soot smeared across her pale porcelain cheek. Her delicate hands trembled wildly from the adrenaline, but she remained upright. Then, the heavy spruce doors slowly, agonizingly pushed open. Thaddeus stepped over the threshold. He looked entirely like a frostbitten ghost. His massive fur-lined coat was encased in a thick, solid shell of ice. His breath rattled in his chest, his immense strength fully depleted by the brutal, hours-long battle with the frozen cables on the upper ridge. He expected to walk into a ruined camp. He expected chaos, a collapsed roof, and panicked men. Instead, he found a fortress. He found the horses secured, the fires roaring, and his men safely huddled together. And standing at the center of it all, illuminated by the golden, flickering light of the hearth, was Evangeline. Thaddeus halted, his chest violently rising and falling. His piercing steel-blue eyes swept over the heavy iron spikes driven into the shutters, the meticulously organized supplies, and finally rested entirely on the fragile, slender woman who had held his world together. A profound tectonic shift occurred in the space between them. She was no longer just a destitute widow he had chosen to shelter. She was a guardian. Without a word, Thaddeus walked heavily toward the fire. The loggers instantly parted for him. He stopped directly in front of Evangeline. He reached up with numb, trembling fingers and pulled the frozen scarf down from his face. Evangeline immediately stepped forward, bridging the physical distance between them. She reached out, her small, warm hands grasping the thick, icy lapels of his coat, helping him shrug off the crushing weight of the frozen canvas. "The upper ridge?" she asked softly, her eyes searching his exhausted, weather-beaten face for injuries. "Secured," Thaddeus murmured, his voice a hoarse, gravelly rasp. He looked down at the soot on her cheek, his gaze softening into something fiercely protective, deeply admiring, and dangerously tender. "You held the line. What protected our home?" Evangeline whispered, the profound weight of the word "our" hanging in the warm, firelit air between them. Thaddeus simply closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, absorbing the immense, healing warmth of that statement. Long after the camp had fallen into the exhausted silence of deep slumber, the lodge remained dark, save for the glowing red embers of the central hearth. Evangeline had finally retreated to her alcove, curled tightly beneath the heavy wool blankets. Thaddeus sat alone in his massive leather chair, the quiet agony of the day's labor finally settling into his heavy bones. He leaned forward, using a long iron poker to stoke the dying embers. As he prodded the ashes, a small, partially burnt piece of heavy parchment flipped over near the edge of the stone grate. It must have fallen from Evangeline's skirts while she was banking the fire earlier. Thaddeus reached down, his thick, bent, calloused fingers pinching the scorched paper. He held it up to the dim red light of the coals. Most of the ink had been eaten by the flames, the elegant cursive rendered completely illegible. But the bottom corner of the letter remained perfectly intact. Pressed deeply into the thick parchment was a heavy, jet-black wax seal. It bore the unmistakable, terrifying crest of a coiled serpent wrapped around a ledger scale, the insignia of the Blackwood Syndicate, the most ruthless, violent debt collection agency in the territory. They were men who did not just collect coin, they collected lives. Thaddeus stared at the black wax, the quiet, protective warmth in his chest instantly crystallizing into a cold, terrifying dread. He looked toward the closed curtain of Evangeline's alcove, his jaw clenching so tight the scar on his cheek pulled white. She was not just grieving. She was hunted. The mountain teaches a man to hide his wounds. In the wild, blood draws wolves, and weakness invites the killing frost. For years, Thaddeus had lived by this brutal, unforgiving law, wrapping his pain in heavy canvas and profound silence. But there comes a terrifying moment in every solitary life when a man must choose between bleeding out in the dark or finally trusting someone else to hold the needle. The morning sun broke over the jagged eastern ridge with a blinding, brittle clarity, illuminating a world entirely buried beneath 4 feet of pristine white powder. The blizzard had passed, leaving behind a silence so absolute it made the ears ring. Inside the lodge, the air was thick with the scent of boiling coffee and the metallic tang of wood smoke. Evangeline stood by the frosted window, her dark charcoal shawl pulled tight, watching the men clear the deeply drifted paths. Her hazel eyes instinctively sought the towering, broad-shouldered silhouette of the foreman. Thaddeus was working near the massive iron winch of the timber sled, his heavy movements unusually rigid. Since the quiet, profound moment by the fire the night before, a new, imperceptible distance had settled over him. He had found the black wax seal of the syndicate, though she did not know it. He carried the terrifying knowledge of her hunters in absolute silence, absorbing the burden so she would not have to. Down in the yard, Silas and Garrick were wrestling with the thick, braided iron logging cable that had snapped during the gale. The massive iron line was heavy with ice, stubbornly resisting the crank of the massive wooden winch. "Put your back into it, Garrick," Silas bellowed, his boots slipping in the deep powder. Thaddeus stepped forward, his massive hands gripping the frozen iron crank to add his immense strength to the effort. The gears groaned, a deep, agonizing shriek of metal under extreme pressure. Evangeline pressed her hand against the cold glass, a sudden, inexplicable knot tightening in her stomach. Without warning, the heavy iron locking cog on the winch shattered. The sound was like a cannon shot echoing off the granite peaks. The massive wooden drum spun wildly backward, releasing thousands of pounds of tension in a fraction of a second. The frayed, broken end of the heavy iron cable whipped through the freezing air faster than the eye could track. It was aimed directly at Garrick's chest. Thaddeus did not hesitate. He lunged across the frozen snow, his massive frame driving the smaller logger violently out of the path of the snapping wire. The heavy frayed iron cable struck Thaddeus across his upper lower arm and shoulder. The sheer, brutal force of the impact tore through the thick fur-lined canvas, sliced through the red flannel, and bit deep into the heavy muscle beneath. Thaddeus let out a single, sharp grunt, his massive body absorbing a blow that would have easily shattered a lesser man's ribs. Inside the lodge, Evangeline's breath completely stopped. She turned and ran. By the time she threw open the massive spruce doors, Silas was already hauling Thaddeus upright. The foreman's face was deathly pale, his jaw clenched so tightly the jagged scar along his cheek pulled stark white. Bright, terrifying crimson blood was already soaking through the dark canvas of his coat, dripping steadily into the pristine snow. "Get him inside," Evangeline commanded, her voice slicing through the frantic shouts of the loggers. Silas half-carried, half-dragged the towering man into the lodge, leaving a stark trail of red across the floorboards. They eased Thaddeus onto the long oak table, knocking the leather ledgers aside. The men hovered uselessly, panicked by the sight of their invincible foreman bleeding so heavily. "Fetch the medical box from the high shelf," Evangeline ordered, her delicate hands already moving toward the ruined sleeve of his heavy coat. "Boil a pot of clean snow, and bring me the clear whiskey." She stepped directly into the space Silas vacated. The sharp, coppery scent of fresh blood hit the air, a smell that had once caused her to faint in the valley parlors. But looking at the weather-beaten face of the man who had shielded her from the storm, her fear completely evaporated, replaced by a fierce, hyper-focused calm. Thaddeus looked down at her. His chest heaved with shallow, rapid breaths. He weakly raised his right hand, his thick fingers grasping her narrow wrist to stop her. "No," Thaddeus murmured, his voice a hoarse, strained rasp. He tried to pull his bleeding arm away, desperately attempting to protect her from the gruesome reality of his injury. "Too much blood. You should not see this." Evangeline gently but firmly pried his heavy, calloused fingers from her wrist. "You did not look away when Mott was broken," she whispered, her hazel eyes locking onto his piercing steel blue gaze. "Mott will not look away from you." A profound, quiet stillness settled over Thaddeus, the frantic noise of the loggers fading entirely into the background. He slowly lowered his right hand, completely surrendering his defense to her. With precise, steady movements, Evangeline used a pair of heavy iron shears to cut away the ruined, blood-soaked canvas and flannel. The gash was deep, a ragged, ugly tear across the dense, shifting landscape of his bicep. Garrick set the boiling water and the bottle of whiskey on the table. Immediately stepping back, his face pale. "Hold his shoulder," Evangeline instructed Silas. She poured the burning liquor directly over the open wound. Thaddeus' massive frame instantly went entirely rigid. The thick muscles in his neck corded, and a low, guttural hiss escaped his teeth, but he did not pull away. Evangeline took a clean, boiling hot cloth and began to wash away the grime, the grease, and the blood. The contrast between them was violently stark. Her pale, delicate porcelain hands, so small they could barely span his wrist, moving with exquisite, agonizing gentleness over his massive, heavily scarred bicep. Every time the wet cloth grazed the raw edge of the wound, she instinctively paused, her own breath catching in perfect sympathy with his sharply drawn inhalations. She threaded the curved surgical needle vacep de hot, heavy black silk. "This will hurt," she breathed, her voice trembling just a fraction. "Do it," Thaddeus rumbled. His eyes locked entirely on the soft, elegant curve of her jawline. She pierced the skin. The work was slow, requiring tremendous force to push the needle through his thick, tough flesh, yet she executed every stitch with the meticulous care of an artist. The physical proximity was overwhelming. She had to lean in close, her chest nearly brushing his uninjured arm, her dark auburn hair slipping from its pins to fall in a soft curtain around her face. Thaddeus lay entirely still, his piercing gaze tracking the tiny, erratic flutter of her pulse at the base of her throat. He felt the terrifying, agonizing sting of the needle, but it was entirely eclipsed by the soft, steady warmth radiating from her slender fingers. For a man who had spent a decade enforcing a punishing, solitary distance between himself and the world, the simple, rhythmic pressure of her hands felt like rain falling on a deeply cracked, barren desert. She was not just closing a wound. She was slowly, meticulously stitching the fractured pieces of his isolated world back together. She tied the final knot and snipped the black thread. The bleeding had stopped. The terrible gash pulled neatly and securely closed. She exhaled a long, shuddering breath, her shoulders dropping in sheer relief. She reached for a clean strip of white linen to bind the arm. As she leaned her delicate weight forward to wrap the bandage around his bicep, the sudden adrenaline crash finally hit Thaddeus. The tremendous loss of blood, combined with the freezing shock of the winter air, momentarily plunged him into a dark, delirious haze. The solid walls of the lodge faded, replaced by the terrifying, roaring white noise of a memory he could never escape. The ice was giving way beneath him. The mountain was falling. Evangeline tied the linen tight and reached for the basin to wash her hands. Suddenly, Thaddeus lunged upward. His massive, uninjured right hand shot out, his thick fingers wrapping around her delicate wrist with desperate, bruising force. Evangeline gasped, dropping the bloody cloth. Thaddeus. His piercing steel blue eyes were blown wide, completely untethered from the present, staring in absolute terror at a ghost only he could see. His chest violently heaved, his grip tightening like a vice, as if she were the only solid thing preventing him from tumbling into a bottomless abyss. "Moat, have you?" "Arthur," Thaddeus breathed, his deep voice cracking into a raw, devastating sob of pure agony. "Hold on. Please. God. Mort will not let you slip." The name hung in the air. A raw, bleeding ghost summoned into the quiet warmth of the lodge. "Arthur." Thaddeus blinked, his chest heaving as the dark, terrifying illusion of the avalanche shattered. The blinding white noise of his memory receded, replaced by the crackle of the hearth and the scent of clear whiskey. He looked down at his massive right hand. His thick, calloused fingers were wrapped like an iron vise around Evangeline's delicate, porcelain wrist. He had gripped her so tightly. The skin beneath his knuckles was completely white. A flash of absolute, horrifying realization crossed his weather-beaten face. He violently yanked his hand back, dropping her wrist as if he had been burned. He slumped back against the heavy oak table, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. The stoic, unyielding fortress of the mountain man had momentarily collapsed, exposing the raw, agonizing ruin beneath. He squeezed his eyes shut, his massive left hand instinctively rising to shield the freshly stitched wound on his shoulder, though the physical pain was nothing compared to the profound shame of his loss of control. Evangeline did not run. She did not shrink away in fear. She simply stood before him, gently rubbing the fading red marks on her wrist. Her hazel eyes filled with a deep, bottomless compassion. She had lived her entire adult life with a man who used his pain as a weapon to punish her. But looking at Thaddeus, she saw a man who was terrified that his pain might accidentally harm someone else. "Lord, I'm sorry," Thaddeus murmured, his voice a broken, gravelly rasp that barely carried over the crackle of the fire. He refused to open his eyes. turning his face toward the shadowed ceiling. You should not have seen that. You should not be near me when the frost takes my mind. A mountain does not apologize for the scars the ice leaves behind, Evangeline whispered softly, quoting a piece of wisdom she had read in one of the camp ledgers. She reached out, her small, warm fingers lightly brushing the uninjured fabric of his flannel sleeve. Rest, Thaddeus. The needle is done. By midnight, the heavy spruce doors were barred against the bitter cold. The loggers had retreated to the bunkhouse annex, their exhausted snores vibrating through the thick wooden walls. The main lodge was dark, illuminated only by the deep, glowing red embers of the central hearth. Thaddeus sat in his heavy leather chair, an old wool blanket draped over his massive shoulders to ward off the chill. The dull, rhythmic throb in his bicep made sleep impossible. He stared into the dying fire, his thick fingers slowly, unconsciously rising to trace the pale, jagged scar along his jawline. A soft, hesitant scrape of wood against the floorboards broke the silence. Thaddeus turned his head. Evangeline emerged from the shadows of her alcove. She was entirely engulfed in the dark charcoal folds of her mourning shawl, her auburn hair falling loose over her narrow shoulders. With tremendous, visible effort, she was dragging the heavy, iron-bound wooden box across the room. Grief is a heavy stone to carry alone, but a secret is a suffocating burial shroud. For weeks, she had guarded that lockbox with the fierce, paranoid desperation of a hunted animal. But the man sitting by the fire had laid his deepest, most agonizing wound bare before her. He had bled for his men, and he had wept for a ghost. The profound, terrifying emotional safety he provided demanded an equal surrender. She dragged the box until it rested directly between his leather chair and the stone hearth. She sank to her knees on the braided rug, her breath pluming faintly in the chilly air. Thaddeus watched her in absolute silence. His piercing steel-blue eyes tracked the delicate tremor in her hands. He did not ask questions. He offered only his quiet, unwavering presence. Evangeline reached beneath the high, frayed lace collar of her dress. From a long, thin silver chain hidden against her skin, she withdrew a heavy brass key. The magistrate in the valley believed Moat was clinging to the last remnants of my dowry. Evangeline breathed, her voice trembling in the stillness of the room. Shikaka ipete, her hazel eyes fixed on the heavy iron lock. The physician thought it held sentimental letters. My husband's creditors believed it held gold. She inserted the key. The massive brass padlock yielded with a sharp, heavy click that echoed like a gunshot in the silent lodge. They all thought Moat guarded a treasure, she whispered, her hands slowly lifting the heavy, scarred wooden lid. But Mott have never guarded anything but my own ruin. Thaddeus leaned forward, the firelight catching the sharp, rugged angles of his face. He looked down into the open box. There was no gold. There were no jewels. No heirlooms. No silver coins. The box was packed entirely to the brim with thick, heavy stacks of crisp banking parchment, ledgers, and legal contracts. The smell of old sealing wax, stale ink, and deceit rose into the air. Evangeline reached in with trembling fingers and lifted a handful of the documents, offering them toward him. Elias Vance was not a merchant, she explained, the terrifying shame finally spilling out in a steady, unbroken stream. He was a master of forgery, a phantom. He built an entire empire of wealth on hollow ledgers and falsified deeds. He borrowed from the banks, he borrowed from the territory, and when they stopped lending, he borrowed from the shadows. Thaddeus' jaw tightened. He recognized the heavy, jet-black wax seals stamping the bottom of several contracts. The coiled serpent. The Blackwood Syndicate. When he died of the fever, the creditors tore through our home like locusts. Evangeline continued, a single tear escaping her lashes to track down her pale porcelain cheek. They took the furniture, the silver, the horses, But they did not find this box. These are the master ledgers, the proof of every forged deed, every stolen tariff, every phantom account he created to steal from the syndicate. If the valley magistrate ever saw these papers, Mort would be hanged as his accomplice. If the syndicate found them, Mort would be sold into the factories to work off a debt Mort could not pay in 10 lifetimes. She dropped the heavy papers back into the box, burying her face in her small, trembling hands. Her fragile frame shook with the sheer, agonizing weight of the confession. She was entirely exposed. The illusion of the respectable, tragic widow was shattered. Leaving only a desperate, hunted fugitive, Thaddeus did not pull away. The towering, silent mountain man slowly leaned forward, his uninjured right arm reaching out across the space between them. He did not touch the papers. He touched her. His massive, calloused hand gently settled over her small, trembling fingers, pulling them away from her tear-streaked face. The sheer size and warmth of his grasp enveloped her completely. He held her hands with the profound, delicate reverence of a man holding a fragile, frozen bird. "You are not his sins," Thaddeus rumbled, his deep baritone vibrating with absolute, unyielding certainty. Evangeline looked up, her breath hitching. She expected judgment. She expected him to order her off the mountain at dawn to protect his camp from the violence she carried. Instead, his piercing steel blue eyes held nothing but an intense, fierce protection. "Mort brought a fragile doll up this mountain," Thaddeus murmured, his thumb gently brushing the back of her knuckles. "But a doll would have shattered under this weight. You are iron, Evangeline. And you are safe here." The profound, agonizing relief of being truly seen and entirely accepted washed over her in a tidal wave. She leaned her forehead against the thick, warm fabric of his blanket, letting the long-held tears of terror finally fall. Not in sorrow, but in absolute, healing exhaustion. The fire popped, sending a shower of golden sparks up the black stone chimney. A deep, profound peace settled over the lodge, the kind of stillness that only exists when two solitary souls finally anchor themselves to one another. Then, out in the freezing dark of the timberline, the camp dogs erupted. It was not the low, warning growl they used for timber wolves. It was a vicious, frenzied, bloodthirsty chorus of barking aimed directly at the western tree line. Thaddeus instantly stiffened, his massive head snapping toward the frosted windows. The gentle warmth vanished, replaced by the terrifying, lethal tension of a predator defending its territory. He released her hands, reaching blindly for the heavy Winchester rifle, leaning against the hearth stones. Evangeline scrambled to her feet, pulling her shawl tight. She moved to the iced glass, rubbing a small circle clear with the heel of her hand. The moon cast a brilliant, blinding white glare across the snowdrifts. At the very edge of the tree line, standing perfectly still, just beyond the reach of the furious, snapping dogs, a tall, slender silhouette was carved against the pines. The shadow raised a hand, deliberately tipping the brim of a bowler hat toward the cabin. There is a specific, terrifying kind of silence that follows the arrival of a predator. It is the sudden, breathless vacuum in the forest when the wolf steps into the clearing. The frenzied barking of the camp dogs abruptly choked off, replaced by a single sharp whistle, slicing through the freezing midnight air. The heavy spruce doors of the lodge did not burst open with the chaotic fury of the wind. They opened slowly, deliberately, the iron hinges letting out a long, agonizing shriek. A man stepped over the threshold, bringing the bitter, suffocating scent of valley smog, stale tobacco and expensive cologne into the clean pine sanctuary of the lodge. He was tall and alarmingly thin, entirely out of place amidst the brutal, rugged landscape of the high timberline. He wore a dark wool coat with a sleek velvet collar, perfectly tailored and entirely unsuited for survival. A silver-tipped walking stick rested casually in his gloved hand. He reached up, deliberately tipping the brim of his pristine bowler hat to knock away a dusting of snow. Evangeline took a sharp, involuntary step backward, her slender spine colliding heavily against the stone hearth. All the blood instantly drained from her face, leaving her porcelain skin a terrifying, deathly white. Her hands flew to her mouth, stifling a gasp as absolute, paralyzing terror seized her throat. She knew this shadow. He was Mercer, the Blackwood Syndicate's most relentless, blood-scented hound. Thaddeus did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. The heavy Winchester rifle was already leveled, the cold steel barrel aimed dead at the center of the intruder's narrow chest. His massive left shoulder, freshly stitched and screaming with dull, agonizing pain, remained perfectly rigid. He stood entirely between the bounty hunter and Evangeline, an immovable, towering wall of heavily scarred muscle and lethal intent. "Step back into the cold," Thaddeus commanded. His deep baritone was no longer the quiet, resonant rumble of a storyteller by the fire. It was the low, vibrating growl of a mountain lion guarding its den. Mercer did not flinch at the sight of the rifle. He simply offered a thin, utterly joyless smile, his dark, calculating eyes sweeping past the towering foreman to find the trembling, delicate woman huddled by the fire. "Mrs. Vance," Mercer drawled, his voice smooth and dripping with mock civility. "Moat must confess, tracking you through that stagecoach wreckage was a tedious affair. The valley magistrate assumed you had crawled under a snowdrift to die. But a little bird down in the supply yard, a man with a rather distinctive red beard, sent word to the valley that a fragile, beautiful widow was balancing the books on the high ridge." Evangeline squeezed her eyes shut, a wave of profound, devastating betrayal crashing over her. "Silas, you are trespassing," Thaddeus rumbled, taking one slow, heavy step forward. The floorboards groaned in protest under his immense weight. The hammer of the Winchester clicked back, a sharp, metallic snap that echoed like a thunderclap in the tense room. "Moat will not ask twice." Mercer lazily reached into the inner pocket of his velvet-collared coat. Thaddeus's finger tightened infinitesimally on the trigger. But instead of a weapon, the bounty hunter withdrew a heavy, folded piece of parchment, stamped with the terrifying, jet-black wax seal of the coiled serpent. "Motum executing a federal mandate," Foreman Mercer stated, flicking the heavy paper open with a snap of his wrist. "Elias Vance defrauded my employers of a staggering sum. The man had the sheer audacity to die before settling his accounts. Under the Territoria Syndicate statutes, his surviving spouse is considered highly valuable collateral. The debt is bound to her flesh." He took a single, arrogant step toward the hearth, Motum taking her back to the valley. "There are factories in the east where a woman of her delicate disposition can work off her late husband's debts. 10, perhaps 15 years of labor should satisfy the interest." The sheer, barbaric cruelty of the threat hung in the warm air, a venomous poison seeping into the sanctuary of the lodge. Evangeline gripped the rough stones of the hearth behind her, her knees buckling. The phantom chains of her late husband's sins were finally tightening around her throat. She had fought so desperately, survived the crash, survived the freeze, only to be dragged back into the suffocating dark. Then, the profound, tectonic shift occurred. Thaddeus lowered the barrel of the rifle a mere inch. He did not look at the bounty hunter. He turned his head slightly, his piercing steel-blue eyes finding Evangeline in the shadows. For weeks he had viewed her as a fragile, tragic victim of circumstance, a wounded bird requiring shelter from the storm. But as he looked at her pale, terrified face, the fractured pieces of the puzzle finally locked into place. He understood the desperate grip on the locked box. He understood her terrifying apology in the snow. She was not running from grief. She was running from monsters. A man who has lost everything lives in a state of constant, quiet retreat. Thaddeus had retreated to the peaks to avoid the pain of failure. But looking at Evangeline, feeling the terrifying, agonizing prospect of watching her, he dragged away into the dark. The retreat finally ended. The deep, protective warmth that had been slowly blossoming in his chest crystallized into absolute, unyielding iron. He would not fail someone he cared for again. Not to the mountain, not to the avalanche, and certainly not to a velvet-collared valley rat. He became, in that single, defining moment, her absolute guardian. Thaddeus shifted his massive stance, entirely eclipsing Mercer's view of Evangeline. He reached back with his uninjured hand, his thick, warm fingers finding her trembling shoulder. He gave her a single, firm squeeze, a silent, profound vow of protection before stepping forward. "The woman stays," Thaddeus stated softly. The quietness of his voice was infinitely more terrifying than a shout. Mercer chuckled. A dry, rattling sound. A noble sentiment. Foreman. Truly heartwarming. But the syndicate does not deal in sentiment. They deal in coin, in blood, and in property. Unless you have $3,000 in Valley gold buried beneath these floorboards, step aside. $3,000. It was a sum so astronomically high, it could buy half the town in the valley below. Thaddeus did not blink. He lowered the Winchester entirely, leaning it against the heavy oak table. He walked slowly toward his massive, cluttered desk in the far corner of the room. His thick fingers rose, unconsciously tracing the pale, jagged scar along his jawline as his mind finalized the devastating, catastrophic choice he was about to make. He opened the heavy bottom drawer. Inside lay a locked iron strongbox. He produced a small key from his pocket, turned the lock, and withdrew a thick, ornately bordered piece of heavy vellum. It was the master deed to the high ridge, the legal ownership of the timber camp, the surrounding forests, the heavy equipment, and the lodge itself. It was his home, his sanctuary, the only thing he possessed in the entire world, bought with a decade of blood, sweat, and the haunting memory of his brother. Thaddeus picked up an ink pen. Without a single moment of hesitation, he signed his bold, heavy signature across the transfer line at the bottom of the parchment. He walked back to the center of the room. He deliberately positioned his massive frame so Evangeline, huddled by the fire, could not see the intricate border or the title of the document. He folded the heavy vellum tightly and thrust it directly into Mercer's gloved hand. "The deed to the upper timberline," Thaddeus murmured, his piercing gaze locking onto the bounty hunter with a lethal, burning intensity. "Appraised last spring at $4,000. The syndicate's debt is satisfied. The widow is clear." Mercer's mocking smile slowly vanished. He unfolded the parchment, his dark eyes scanning the heavy ink, searching for the deception. Finding none, a look of genuine, stunned disbelief crossed his narrow face. He looked from the priceless deed in his hands to the towering, scarred mountain man, utterly baffled by the magnitude of the sacrifice. "You are trading your entire livelihood," Mercer breathed, his voice stripped of its arrogant drawl. "For a fragile valley widow." "Motam trading paper for a life," Thaddeus replied, his jaw clenched tight. "Take it. Mount your horse. And if Mort ever see your shadow on this mountain again, Mort will not bother with the rifle. Mort will bury you in the ravine with my bare hands." Mercer swallowed hard, the terrifying reality of Thaddeus's proximity finally breaking his nerve. He carefully folded the deed, slipping it into the inner pocket of his coat, right next to his silver revolver. The bounty hunter took a slow step backward toward the heavy spruce doors. He gripped the iron latch, pulling the door open to the howling, freezing wind. He paused on the threshold, a dark, calculating glint returning to his eyes. A generous trade. Foreman, Mercer sneered, pulling his coat tight against the gale. The syndicate will accept this DOV kept no payment with pleasure. But you are a fool if you think a valley debt simply vanishes into the snow. Mercer tipped his hat one final time, his eyes briefly flicking toward the hidden shadows near the fire. Keep her warm. Foreman. Moat will be back before the spring thaw. The door slammed shut, the heavy iron latch dropping into place with a terrifying finality. Thaddeus stood alone in the center of the room, the agonizing throb in his freshly stitched shoulder momentarily eclipsed by the crushing, devastating weight of what he had just done. He had saved her life, but he had surrendered his kingdom to monsters. Behind him, Evangeline slowly stepped out from the shadows. Her hazel eyes were wide, filled with lingering terror and a profound, desperate confusion. She had not seen the paper. She did not know the catastrophic price he had just paid for her breath. "Thaddeus," she whispered, her voice trembling in the quiet gloom. What did he mean? Why is he coming back? The heavy iron latch of the door had scarcely settled before Evangeline's terrified question broke the stifling silence of the lodge. She stood against the hearth, her slender fingers trembling as they gripped her dark mourning shawl. "Thaddeus," she breathed, her voice barely a whisper in the quiet gloom. What did he mean? Why is he coming back? Thaddeus turned slowly. His massive chest rose and fell with heavy, measured breaths, the exertion pulling painfully at the fresh stitches in his shoulder. He looked at her pale, frightened face, his piercing steel blue eyes softening instantly to mask the catastrophic reality of what he had just done. A man who has spent his life wrestling with the sheer, crushing weight of the mountain learns exactly how to bury an avalanche beneath a calm surface. He meant nothing, Thaddeus rumbled, his deep baritone steady and completely devoid of the panic tearing through his own mind. A hound barking at the wind to sound dangerous. The debt is settled. You are safe. He walked heavily toward her, the floorboards groaning beneath his worn leather boots. Stopping just inches away, he reached out with his uninjured hand. With exquisite, agonizing gentleness, he tucked a stray lock of auburn hair behind her ear. His thick, calloused fingers lingered for a fraction of a second against her pale porcelain cheek, a silent, grounding vow. "Sleep," he murmured, his gaze locking onto hers with absolute, unyielding authority. "There are no more monsters in the timberline tonight." Evangeline wanted to believe him. She desperately craved the illusion of absolute safety his towering presence provided. But a dark, insidious knot of dread remained coiled in her stomach as she retreated to her alcove. By the time the bitter dawn broke, the camp dynamic had violently shifted. Thaddeus did not raise his voice, nor did he explain his actions to the crew. He simply walked out to the yard, found Silas tightening a saddle cinch, and pointed a massive, scarred finger down the treacherous mountain trail. The towering red-bearded logger took one look at the lethal, icy stillness in the foreman's eyes, and instantly understood. Silas packed his canvas bag in utter silence and began the long, freezing walk down to the valley, entirely banished from the sanctuary he had betrayed. For 3 days, a deceptive, quiet routine settled over the high ridge. Thaddeus worked the timberline with a relentless, punishing ferocity, pushing his massive frame to the absolute limit of endurance, despite the dull agony in his stitched shoulder. Evangeline watched him from the frosted windows, her heart aching with a profound, terrifying surge of emotional reliance. No one had ever fought for her. No one had ever banished a threat to ensure her peace. The protective warmth he radiated was breaking down the final, stubborn walls of her grief, leaving behind a fierce, deeply rooted attachment she could barely name. On the 4th afternoon, the loggers were miles away on the upper ridge, leaving the main lodge steeped in profound silence. Evangeline sat at the massive oak desk in the corner, surrounded by neat stacks of ledgers and banking drafts. She was compiling the final year-end capital assets report, a mathematical necessity before the deep winter ice completely cut them off from the valley. She needed the baseline property tax valuation for the lodge. Her delicate fingers opened the heavy bottom drawer of Thaddeus's desk. Inside sat the iron strongbox he had opened the night the bounty hunter arrived. The key still rested in the lock, entirely forgotten in the chaotic aftermath. Evangeline lifted the heavy iron lid. Inside, resting perfectly centered on the velvet lining, was a thick, embossed leather folder labeled title and deed. She opened the folder to retrieve the valuation numbers. It was empty. Evangeline froze, a sudden terrifying chill sweeping through her veins, entirely unrelated to the freezing draft rattling the shutters. She stared at the empty leather pocket, her fiercely analytical mind trained to unravel the most complex financial deceptions her late husband could invent. Immediately began aligning the fractured pieces of that terrifying night. Mercer had demanded $3,000. Thaddeus had stated he possessed no such gold. Thaddeus had reached into this exact drawer, signed a heavy piece of vellum, and handed it to the bounty hunter. Mercer had looked entirely stunned, calling it a generous trade and questioning why Thaddeus would trade his entire livelihood for a valley widow. Desperate to prove her terrifying theory wrong, Evangeline frantically dug through the remaining papers in the iron box. Her trembling fingers finally closed around an old, folded municipal appraisal from the previous spring. She snapped the parchment open. Her hazel eyes scanned the neat, black ink. Property assessed, the Upper Ridge timberline, logging equipment, and main lodge. Assessed market value, $4,000. The paper slipped from her trembling fingers, fluttering silently to the braided rug. It hit her with the brutal, devastating force of a physical blow. Thaddeus had not simply paid off a debt. He had traded his absolute entirety. He had signed away his sanctuary, his kingdom, the only home he had ever known, all to purchase her freedom from the syndicate. He had bought her life with his own ruin. Evangeline buried her face in her hands, a broken, agonizing sob tearing from her throat. The sheer magnitude of his sacrifice shattered her. She wept with a violence she had not allowed herself since the stagecoach crash, her slender frame shaking uncontrollably against the heavy wood of the desk. He was the most honorable, deeply good man she had ever known, and she was destroying him. The curse of Elias Vance was still alive, clinging to her flesh, infecting the only pure thing left in her world. Thaddeus had spent years building this high-altitude fortress to escape the pain of his past, and in a single heartbeat, he had surrendered it all because he could not bear to see her dragged away into the dark. "No," Evangeline whispered, her voice choking on a fresh wave of tears. She pressed her hands flat against the cold wood of the desk, forcing her spine completely straight. "Moat will not be your ruin. If the syndicate held the deed, they held the mountain. But if the collateral they originally sought, the surviving widow, surrendered herself willingly to the magistrate in the valley, the debt transfer could be legally contested. She could trade herself back. She could restore his kingdom." The profound, terrifying realization brought a strange, icy calm over her. Midnight arrived with a howling, bitter squall that rattled the heavy iron hinges of the lodge. The hearth had burned down to a low, smoldering red glow. The heavy snores of the exhausted loggers vibrated from the annex. Evangeline stood in the center of the dark room, entirely engulfed in her dark charcoal morning dress. She had packed a small, worn leather satchel kept hot, only her barest essentials and the locked wooden box containing her husband's fraudulent ledgers. She would need the proof of his crimes to negotiate with the magistrate. She turned toward the massive leather chair by the fire. Resting over the back of it was the heavy, fur-lined canvas coat Thaddeus had draped over her shivering shoulders on her very first day. Tears silently tracked down her pale porcelain cheeks as she reached out, her small fingers brushing the rough canvas. It smelled intensely of cedar sap, horsehair, and the clean, biting scent of fresh snow. It smelled like absolute safety. It smelled like him. She could not take it. It belonged to the mountain. With agonizing slowness, she pulled her frayed, dark shawl tight around her narrow shoulders. She walked to the heavy spruce doors, her footsteps entirely silent against the floorboards. She lifted the heavy iron latch, the frozen metal biting fiercely into her delicate skin. She looked back one final time into the warm, shadowed sanctuary that had miraculously healed her fractured soul. "Forgive me," Evangeline breathed into the quiet dark. She pulled the door open, stepping out into the blinding, freezing fury of the midnight snow, entirely determined to walk down the mountain and face the wolves, so the solitary guardian of the high ridge could keep his home. The mountain does not forgive martyrs. Out, in the blinding, chaotic fury of the midnight squall, the cold did not merely bite, it consumed. It sank its icy teeth directly into the marrow, stripping away the heat of the blood in a matter of seconds. Evangeline plunged waist-deep into the massive snowdrifts, her worn leather boots finding no purchase on the treacherous hidden ice beneath. The heavy, iron-bound lockbox dragged her right arm down, agonizingly heavy, a physical manifestation of the crushing guilt she carried. She wore no coat. Her dark charcoal morning shawl offered no resistance to the brutal, horizontal sheets of snow tearing across the high ridge. Every step was a monumental battle of will. The wind screamed through the ancient pines, a deafening, terrifying roar that swallowed the frantic sound of her own ragged breathing. She could not feel her fingers. Her porcelain cheeks burned with the terrifying, numb heat of advancing frostbite. Yet, she pushed forward, driven by the absolute, unyielding desperation to save the man who had traded his entire existence for her breath. Back in the dead silence of the main lodge, a violent, rattling gust of wind blew the heavy spruce door open just an in. The iron latch had not fully caught. A thin, vicious ribbon of freezing air swept across the floorboards, cutting through the residual warmth of the dying hearth. Thaddeus woke instantly. A man accustomed to the lethal unpredictability of the timberline does not rise slowly. He bolted upright in the massive leather chair, his piercing steel-blue eyes immediately scanning the shadowed room. The fire was entirely dead. The room was freezing. His gaze fell upon the alcove. The heavy canvas curtain was pulled completely back. The narrow cot was empty. A sudden, paralyzing spike of terror, colder than any winter frost, drove directly into his chest. Ignoring the sharp, tearing pain in his stitched shoulder, he reached the massive oak desk. The bottom drawer hung open. The iron strongbox was unlocked, the heavy leather folder empty, and the municipal appraisal lay abandoned on the braided rug. She knew. Thaddeus did not breathe. He did not think. He operated purely on raw, terrifying instinct. He seized his heavy fur-lined canvas coat from the chair, throwing it over his broad shoulders, and snatched the heavy Winchester rifle from the wall. He threw the heavy spruce doors completely open, stepping out into the violently churning darkness. The tracks were faint, already rapidly filling with the driving snow, leading directly down the treacherous, winding trail toward the valley. He ran. The immense, towering mountain man plunged through the waist-deep powder with the terrifying, unstoppable momentum of a landslide. The wind howled, whipping his dark brown beard and stinging his weather-beaten face, but he felt absolutely nothing. The jagged scar along his jawline pulled tight against the frozen air. The paralyzing, suffocating nightmare of the avalanche roared back to life in his mind. The terrifying certainty that the mountain was going to take another soul he loved entirely shattered his stoic armor. A mile down the trail, the tree canopy thinned, exposing the narrow ridge to the full, devastating force of the crosswind. Evangeline could go no further. Her knees finally buckled. She collapsed into the deep powder, the heavy iron lockbox slipping from her numb, frozen fingers. The dark charcoal fabric of her dress was encased in a thick shell of ice. She tried to push herself back up, but her slender, delicate frame possessed absolutely no strength left. The edges of her vision violently narrowed, blurring into the deadly, hypnotic gray haze of hypothermia. She closed her eyes, surrendering to the creeping warmth of the freeze. Then, a massive shadow completely eclipsed the howling wind. Strong, calloused hands violently gripped her narrow shoulders, hauling her upward out of the snowbank with desperate, crushing force. Evangeline gasped, her eyes fluttering open. Thaddeus stood over her, his chest heaving with terrifying ragged gasps. He looked entirely wild, a man driven to the absolute brink of madness by the fear of losing her. He immediately unfastened his heavy canvas coat and stripped it from his shoulders, wrapping the immense, heavy warmth completely around her freezing body. "Let me go," Evangeline cried out, her voice a broken, fragile wisp immediately swallowed by the gale. She weakly pushed her trembling hands against his massive, solid chest, fighting him with whatever pitiful strength remained in her hollow bones. "You cannot save me." "Mott know what you did." Mott found the empty folder. Thaddeus did not let go. He pulled her flush against his chest, completely wrapping his thick, powerful arms around her delicate frame, refusing to allow even an inch of space between them. "You traded your kingdom," she sobbed, the tears instantly freezing on her pale cheeks. She beat her numb fists against his flannel shirt, entirely shattered by her own guilt. "You traded your home to those monsters for a broken, hunted widow. If Moat surrender to the magistrate, they will give you the mountain back. Moat will not be your ruin." "Stop fighting me," Thaddeus roared, his deep baritone completely overpowering the deafening shriek of the storm. He caught her flailing wrists, pinning them gently but firmly against his chest. He ducked his massive head down, pressing his rough, weather-beaten forehead directly against hers. He forced her to look into his piercing steel blue eyes. The impenetrable, stoic fortress was entirely gone, leaving behind a raw, agonizing desperation that stole the breath straight from her lungs. "What good is an empty mountain?" Thaddeus rasped, his voice cracking with a profound, devastating vulnerability. Evangeline froze, staring up at him through the violent swirl of the snow. Mott spent 10 years building a fortress of timber and stone to keep the world out. Because Mott was terrified of failing to protect anyone ever again, he confessed, the truth tearing out of him like blood from a deep wound. Mott bought a kingdom of ice, and Mott was completely, entirely dead inside of it, until you stepped through my door. He released her wrists, bringing his thick, calloused hands up to cup her freezing face. His thumbs gently brushed the icy tears from her cheeks, his touch carrying an agonizingly deep, fierce reverence. "You think a piece of paper is worth more than your breath?" he breathed, his gaze burning with intense, unyielding devotion. "You think Mort care about heavy machinery or a lodge? You are my sanctuary, Evangeline. Mott do not want the mountain if you are not on it. Mort needs you." The absolute, undeniable truth of his words struck her with the force of a physical blow. He did not cape her as a burden. He did not view the loss of his deed as a tragedy. He viewed her as his salvation. The terrifying, profound depth of her emotional dependence on him finally collided with the realization that he was just as deeply dependent on her. She let out a shattering sob, completely collapsing against his immense chest. She buried her face in the warm, cedar-scented flannel of his shirt, her trembling arms wrapping tightly around his broad waist. Thaddeus buried his face in her snowy auburn hair, holding her with a desperate, crushing intensity, as if trying to shield her from the very existence of the cold. But the mountain had not finished testing them. Without warning, the atmospheric pressure violently plummeted. The howling crosswind abruptly died, creating a terrifying, suffocating vacuum of dead silence for 3 agonizing seconds. Then, The secondary storm hit. It was not a squall. It was a complete atmospheric collapse. A sheer horizontal wall of blinding white ice slammed into the ridge, dropping the temperature by 20 degrees in a single heartbeat. The sheer force of the gale nearly knocked Thaddeus off his feet. He staggered, throwing his massive weight forward to shield Evangeline, but the visibility instantly dropped to absolute zero. They could not see the trail. They could not see the tree line. The high ridge had become a lethal, disorienting void of freezing white death. "We cannot make it back," Thaddeus shouted, his voice barely audible over the apocalyptic roar of the new storm. He frantically scanned the blinding whiteout, his sharp eyes searching for any break in the terrain. Through a brief, violent tear, in the squall, he spotted a jagged, shadowed outline clinging to the edge of the granite cliff about 50 yards off the trail. It was an old, decaying hunting blind, abandoned decades ago by trappers. "Hold on to me," he commanded. He did not wait for her to walk. He scooped her fragile, delicate frame entirely into his massive arms, ignoring the agonizing, burning pain tearing through his freshly stitched shoulder. He plunged off the trail, fighting his way through the chest-deep drifts with brute, terrifying strength. He reached the decaying wooden structure, kicking the rotting door open with a heavy thrust of his boot. He carried her inside, slamming the splintered wood shut against the howling void. The tiny, pitch-black space was entirely barren, the floorboards rotted, and the wind screaming fiercely through the gaping cracks in the walls. The temperature inside was scarcely warmer than the raging blizzard outside. They were completely cut off from the lodge, trapped in a ruined wooden box, dangling over the edge of the ravine, while the deadliest storm of the decade completely sealed the mountain around them. The cold is not merely an absence of heat. In the Hat Peaks, it is a living, breathing entity. It is a wolf circling in the dark, testing the perimeter, waiting for the fire to die and the eyelids to droop. Inside the ruined, pitch-black hunting blind, the wolf had already broken through the door. The tiny structure was no larger than a wagon bed, suspended precariously over the jagged lip of the ravine. Every violent gust of the apocalyptic squall threatened to tear the rotting floorboards completely from the granite cliff. The air inside was absolute, suffocating ice, thick with the smell of decay, ancient dust, and the sharp metallic bite of the freeze. Thaddeus moved blindly in the terrifying darkness. His massive hands felt along the splintered walls, finding gaping fissures where the wind screamed through like a dying animal. He found a pile of stiff, decaying burlap sacks frozen to the floorboards. Operating on sheer, brutal survival instinct, he jammed the rotting fabric into the largest cracks, cutting off the worst of the horizontal drafts. It was not enough. Without a hearth, without a spark, the ambient temperature in the wooden box would plunge to a lethal low within the hour. He turned back toward the center of the dark room. He could not see Evangeline, but he could hear the violent, uncontrollable rattling of her breath. Hypothermia was no longer threatening. It had arrived. "Evangeline," Thaddeus commanded, his deep baritone a steady, vibrating anchor in the terrifying void. He found her huddled in the corner. She had curled into a tight, defensive ball, her knees pulled completely flush against her chest, her small hands clutching the heavy canvas coat he had wrapped around her. She was shivering so violently that her teeth clicked together, a frantic, helpless sound that drove a spike of pure agony directly into his chest. Thaddeus sank to the floorboards. The rigid, unyielding mountain man cast aside every remaining shred of physical distance. Survival demanded absolute, terrifying intimacy. He pulled her entirely into his lap. He spread the massive, fur-lined canvas coat open, wrapping the heavy garment completely around them both, creating a single, sealed cocoon against the void. He crossed his thick, powerful arms tightly around her fragile waist, pressing her back flush against his broad chest. He buried his face into the curve of her neck, letting his heavy dark beard rest against her freezing porcelain skin. He became her human furnace. The sheer, overwhelming mass of his body enveloped her completely, trapping his radiating heat against her trembling frame. For several agonizing minutes, the only sounds in the pitch-black blind were the deafening roar of the blizzard and the heavy, rhythmic thud of his heart. Evangeline pressed her cheek against his chest, her ear resting perfectly over his heartbeat. The steady, powerful drumbeat felt like the only real thing left in the universe. Her small, numb fingers weakly curled into the worn red flannel of his shirt. Slowly, agonizingly, the violent tremors racking her delicate body began to subside. The intense, grounding heat of his skin bled through his clothing, seeping into her frozen marrow. The scent of cedar sap, horsehair, and his raw, masculine warmth wrapped around her, acting as a profound emotional shield against the terror outside. "Maud, I'm sorry," Evangeline whispered into the dark. Her voice a fragile, hoarse thread. "Do not speak," Thaddeus rumbled gently, his chest vibrating against her back. His massive right hand drifted up, his thick, calloused fingers gently stroking her icy auburn hair in a rhythmic, profoundly tender motion. "Save your breath. The storm will break." "Won't have to speak," she breathed, her hazel eyes staring blindly into the pitch-black space. "If Mott close my eyes, the cold feels warm. Mott cannot let it feel warm." The terrifying symptom of late-stage hypothermia. Thaddeus' jaw clenched so tight the jagged scar along his cheek pulled agonizingly taut. He tightened his crushing grip around her waist, fiercely determined to tether her soul to the earth through sheer physical force. "Then talk to me," Thaddeus murmured, his voice thick with a raw, desperate emotion he could no longer hide. "In the valley, Moat learned to shrink," Evangeline confessed, her words halting and frail. "Elias filled every room with his demands, his lies, his debts. Moat made myself as small as possible so the monsters would not notice me. Moat thought survival meant disappearing." She tilted her head back slightly, her cold cheek resting against the rough, warm column of his throat. "But you do not shrink," she whispered, a deep, profound awe bleeding into her tone. "The world batters against you. The ice tries to break you, and you just plant your boots and hold the sky up. You are the strongest thing Mort have ever known. And you traded it all for a ghost." "You are no ghost," Thaddeus rasped, his voice cracking entirely. He closed his eyes in the dark. The howling wind outside seemed to mock him, sounding exactly like the agonizing roar of the shifting ice field 10 years ago. The terrifying, paralyzing fear he had kept buried beneath his stoic armor for a decade completely fractured. The wolf was at the door, and physical strength could not keep it out. "Moat am not strong," Evangeline, Thaddeus confessed, the brutal, merest, devastating truth spilling into the cold air between them. "Moat am a coward holding a shield. Moat built that lodge. Mott claimed that ridge, because Mott was terrified of this exact moment." Evangeline went perfectly still, her hazel eyes wide in the dark. "Arthur was 19, Thaddeus murmured, the phantom weight of the past crushing his lungs. "My younger brother. We were clearing a high pass." Moat read the snowpack wrong. "I thought the ice was solid. When the shelf broke, the sound was like the world tearing in half. He slipped." Moat caught his hand. Thaddeus' thick fingers trembled against her waist. The mountain man, who had fearlessly faced down a ruthless bounty hunter and walked through an apocalyptic whiteout, was shaking. Moat had his hand. Thaddeus breathed, single hot tear escaping his lashes and falling into her auburn hair. Moat gripped him so hard my fingers bled. "But the mountain is heavier than any man. The ice dragged him down and it tore his fingers right out of mine." Moat watched him fall into the white. Moat could not save him. The profound, agonizing depth of his wound was fully exposed. Evangeline finally understood the haunted, solitary silence in his steel-blue eyes. She understood why he demanded to carry her iron-bound box, why he stepped between her and the crosswind, and why the very thought of the syndicate taking her had driven him to surrender his entire kingdom. He was not just protecting a widow. He was fighting a war against the grief that had already destroyed him once. "Mort, am terrified." "Evangeline," Thaddeus whispered, pressing his forehead against her temple, entirely surrendering his impenetrable armor. "Not of losing the deed. Not of the syndicate. Mott, am terrified that the mountain is finally taking what Mott loved most again. And Mott cannot stop it. What Mott loved most." The quiet, devastating confession hung in the freezing air, striking a match in the deepest, darkest cavern of her heart. He loved her, Basp. He had loved her since she proved her iron will in the clinic, since she stitched his wound, since she unlocked her darkest secrets by the fire. Overwhelmed by a fierce, undeniable wave of absolute devotion, Evangeline reached her right hand up in the dark, seeking his face to comfort him. Her small, trembling finger brushed against his thick beard, then slid down the heavy canvas collar toward his left shoulder. She expected to feel the rough, dry texture of his flannel shirt. Instead, her fingers sank into something horrifyingly wet, thick, and intensely warm. Evangeline gasped, the terrifying realization violently piercing the emotional haze. The heavy, unyielding warmth she had been absorbing from his body was not just body heat. "Thaddeus," she breathed, panic instantly seizing her throat. She frantically pressed her hand deeper against his left bicep. The heavy canvas was entirely soaked. The brutal exertion of carrying her through the waist-deep snow, of forcing the heavy wooden door open, of acting as her physical shield, had violently ripped the black silk stitches completely open. The freezing temperature was acting as a deceptive, numbing agent, masking the pain while he quietly, continuously bled out into the dark. His head suddenly grew heavy, slumping forward to rest entirely against her shoulder. The powerful, crushing grip of his arms around her waist slackened, his massive body beginning to lose the war against the cold and the blood loss. "Stay with me," Evangeline cried out into the pitch-black void, desperately gripping his face. "Thaddeus, please. Keep your eyes open. The mountain does not yield to panic. It demands absolute, terrifying action." In the suffocating, pitch-black void of the ruined hunting blind, Evangeline felt the thick, terrifying warmth rapidly spreading beneath her trembling fingers. The fragile, delicate valley widow would have wept, paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the disaster. But the woman forged in the brutal, honest fires of the high timberline went to war. She frantically unfastened the heavy brass toggles of his canvas coat, peeling the thick, freezing fabric back to expose his ruined flannel shirt. "Keep your eyes on me," Evangeline commanded, her voice vibrating with a sudden, unyielding iron. She reached down, her numb fingers gripping the heavy, frayed hem of her dark charcoal morning dress. With a violent, desperate heave, she tore a long, thick strip of the heavy wool fabric entirely free. She blindly wrapped the torn fabric around his massive, bleeding bicep, pulling the makeshift bandage terrifyingly tight, anchoring the knot with every final ounce of strength remaining in her slender bones. Thaddeus let out a low, guttural hiss in the dark, his heavy head rolling against the splintered wall. The agonizing pressure brought a fraction of lucidity back to his fading mind. "Evangeline," Thaddeus rasped, his massive right hand weakly seeking hers in the dark. "Do not speak," she breathed, violently interrupting him. She crawled completely onto his lap, pressing both of her small hands directly over the heavy wool bandage. She threw her entire delicate weight against the terrible wound, using her own body as a living barricade to keep his life force trapped inside his veins. She pressed her cold forehead against his cheek, mingling her freezing tears with the sweat of his fever. "You are not leaving me in the dark. Do you hear me? You promised me sanctuary. You will not break your word." The hours stretched into an agonizing, silent eternity. She held the pressure until her arms went completely numb, until her shoulders burned with a deep, consuming fire, until the terrifying, erratic rhythm of his heartbeat finally leveled into a slow, shallow, but steady drum. Then, the apocalyptic roar of the blizzard abruptly choked off. The wind died, entirely spent. The terrible vibrating pressure of the storm vanished, replaced by an absolute, ringing silence. A single, blinding beam of brittle golden morning light pierced through the splintered gaps in the rotting wood, illuminating the frosted dust dancing in the freezing air. Evangeline blinked, her hazel eyes adjusting to the sudden light. Thaddeus was unconscious, his weather-beaten face deathly pale, his dark brown beard crusted with frost, but his chest still rose and fell beneath her small hands. He was alive. Outside, a faint, rhythmic crunching sound echoed across the deep powder. "Foreman," the shout was muffled, distant, but undeniably human. Evangeline instantly tore her hands away from the blood-soaked wool. She scrambled off his lap, throwing her exhausted, battered weight against the rotting wooden door. The ice had sealed it shut. She beat her bruised fists against the splintered planks, screaming out into the blinding white void. "Here. We are here." The door violently shuddered from the outside, then burst open in a shower of shattered ice. Garrick stood in the blinding sun, a heavy iron snow shovel in his hands, his permanently scowling face dropping into an expression of absolute, stunned relief. Behind him, 4 massive draft horses stomped nervously in the deep drifts, completely harnessed to a heavy wooden timber sled. "We found the lockbox on the trail," Garrick breathed, his eyes darting from Evangelina's tear-streaked face to the towering, unconscious mountain man slumped in the corner. "Get the blankets. Move." The journey back up the treacherous ridge was a blur of frantic, exhausting motion. The loggers hauled their bleeding foreman onto the heavy timber sled, wrapping him in mountains of thick wool. Evangeline refused to ride the horses. She sat directly on the wooden planks of the sled beside him, her slender hands clutching his thick, calloused fingers, her hazel eyes locked onto his pale face the entire grueling ascent. By midday, the heavy spruce doors of the main lodge closed behind them, shutting out the brilliant, blinding glare of the snow. The lodge was a sanctuary of roaring fires and boiling water. The air was thick with the scent of pine needles, clean linen, and the profound heavy relief of survival. Thaddeus lay in his massive alcove bed, buried beneath layers of heavy furs. Evangeline had cleaned the wound, re-stitched the torn flesh, and poured hot, bitter tea down his throat, until the terrifying pallor finally left his face. The physical storm had passed, but the emotional landscape between them had been permanently, irreversibly altered. The stoic distance was gone. The quiet, hesitant respect had completely burned away, leaving behind a profound, intense devotion that filled the warm air of the lodge like a heavy perfume. Late in the afternoon, Thaddeus finally opened his piercing steel-blue eyes. Evangeline was sitting in a wooden chair drawn flush against the edge of his bed. She had washed the soot and tears from her porcelain skin. Her dark auburn hair fell in soft, loose waves around her shoulders, entirely unpinned. The dark charcoal morning dress, torn and ruined, had been replaced by one of his oversized, soft white flannel shirts. The sleeves rolled heavily up her delicate arms. She was reading from the leather ledger, the heavy iron-bound box, resting securely at the foot of his bed. Thaddeus did not move. He simply watched her. He watched the firelight dance across the soft curve of her cheekbone. He watched the quiet, rhythmic rise and fall of her chest. A fierce, sudden jealousy seized his heart. Not of another man, but of time itself. He resented every hour of his life he had spent on this mountain before she arrived. The emotional dependence was absolute. He could no longer imagine drawing a breath in a room she did not occupy. "You look like the morning," Thaddeus murmured. His deep baritone a raw, gravelly rasp that vibrated warmly through the quiet space. Evangeline immediately dropped the ledger, a brilliant, breathtaking smile breaking across her face. She leaned forward, bridging the tiny physical gap between them. She did not hesitate. She reached out, her soft, warm hand gently cupping his weather-beaten cheek, her thumb lightly tracing the pale, jagged scar along his jawline. Thaddeus closed his eyes, leaning his heavy face into the incredible, grounding warmth of her touch. His uninjured hand rose from beneath the heavy furs, capturing her delicate wrist, pulling her palm flush against his lips for a single, deeply reverent kiss. There were no grand declarations. The terrifying truth had already been spoken in the dark. The unspoken love flowing between them was a tangible, undeniable force, heavier than the mountain itself. Suddenly, the heavy iron latch of the main lodge door clattered open. Evangeline jumped, instinctively pulling back. But Thaddeus refused to release her wrist, his grip tightening protectively. Garrick stepped into the room, followed immediately by a stranger. The man was wrapped in a thick, frost-covered valley coat, his face entirely red from the bitter ride. He was a bank courier, shivering violently as he stepped toward the central hearth. "A rider from the valley," Garrick announced, his voice tight with unease. He forced his horse up the lower switchbacks before the snow completely froze over. Thaddeus's eyes narrowed. The fierce, protective mountain lion instantly returning to his gaze. He slowly pushed himself up against the heavy wooden headboard, ignoring the dull throb in his shoulder. "Speak," Thaddeus commanded. The courier nervously fumbled with his heavy leather satchel. He withdrew a single crisp piece of heavy vellum. It was the master deed Thaddeus had signed over to Mercer, but slashed diagonally across the beautiful ornate handwriting was a single devastating word stamped in stark red ink. "Rejet. The magistrate sends his regards," the courier stammered, holding the ruined deed out. The Blackwood Syndicate reviewed the territorial statutes. The debt Elias Vance incurred cannot be satisfied by property transfers from a third party. The widow is the sole legal collateral. Evangeline's breath caught in her throat. The terrifying phantom of her late husband had reached out from the grave once more, completely voiding Thaddeus' sacrifice. "They rejected the deed," the courier whispered, taking a terrified step backward as he looked at the lethal fury darkening Thaddeus's face. "The syndicate has secured a federal writ. Armed marshals are riding up the mountain pass. They will be here in 3 days to seize the camp, the equipment, and the widow by absolute force. When a man has nothing left to lose, a countdown means very little. But when he has finally found the single breathing soul that makes his silent world whole, the ticking of a clock becomes a deafening, agonizing terror. 3 days, 72 hours before the marshals would crest the high ridge with federal warrants and loaded weapons. The moment the valley courier spurred his exhausted horse back down the treacherous mountain trail, the main lodge transformed from a quiet sanctuary of healing into a fortress preparing for a siege. Thaddeus stood by the central hearth, his uninjured right arm moving with a dark, lethal efficiency. He broke open the heavy Winchester rifle, checking the chamber before moving to the iron box of heavy ammunition. His jaw was clenched so tightly, the pale, jagged scar along his cheekbone pulled completely stark against his weather-beaten face. The loggers, taking their silent cue from their foreman, began dragging heavy oak tables toward the frosted windows, fully prepared to barricade the heavy spruce doors and hold the ridge in a brutal, bloody crossfire. Evangeline watched the hardened men prepare for war. Her delicate hands gripped the soft, oversized flannel of Thaddeus's shirt, pulling it tightly across her chest. A terrifying, icy dread pooled in her stomach. If the marshals rode up that trail, Thaddeus would stand exactly where he always stood, squarely between her and the threat, and the sheer numbers would slaughter him. The federal government would not care about the honor of a mountain man. They would shoot him down, burn his beautiful kingdom to the ashes, and drag her away over his corpse. She absolutely refused to be the cause of his death. "Put the rifle down," Evangeline commanded. Her voice was not a shout, but the absolute, ringing clarity of her tone sliced cleanly through the chaotic scraping of heavy furniture. Thaddeus froze, his massive fingers resting on the cold steel barrel. He slowly turned his head, his piercing steel blue eyes locking onto her pale porcelain face. He read the fierce, unyielding determination setting her jaw. "A war of paper cannot be won with lead," Evangeline murmured, stepping forward into the firelight. She walked directly to his massive desk, her hazel eyes burning with a brilliant, analytical fire. "If you shoot a federal marshal, you will hang, Thaddeus, and if you hang, the syndicate wins. They will take the mountain, and they will take me. Moat will not let you bleed for my husband's sins again." She dragged the heavy, iron-bound wooden box onto the long oak table, pushing the ammunition boxes aside. She produced her brass key, violently snapping the heavy padlock open. "Barricade the doors to keep the weather out," Evangeline instructed the silent room of towering loggers, her slender hands already pulling thick stacks of heavily sealed parchment from the box. "Keep the fires roaring, but no man fires a shot." Elias Vance built a cage of ink and deceit. "Moat, I'm going to find the broken bar." For the next 48 hours, the fragile, delicate widow did not sleep. Day and night blurred into a hazy, suffocating vigil of burnt lamp oil and the relentless, heavy scratch of a steel-nibbed pen. She spread the entirety of her late husband's fraudulent empire across the long oak table, cross-referencing his hidden ledgers with the legal contracts the Blackwood Syndicate had weaponized. The sheer, dizzying complexity of the numbers would have broken a lesser mind, but her terrible suffering in the valley had forged her intellect into a brilliant, unyielding blade. Thaddeus did not leave her side. He could not decipher the labyrinth of banking tariffs or phantom corporate codes, but he understood endurance. While she fought the silent war of the mind, he became her absolute, unwavering anchor. He moved quietly around the lodge, his massive frame a constant, protective presence in her peripheral vision. He kept the central hearth roaring, shielding the room from the bitter mountain drafts. Late on the second night, the lodge was steeped in profound silence, broken only by the hiss of the brass oil lamp and the distant howling of the wind. Evangeline rubbed her bloodshot hazel eyes, a wave of crushing, agonizing exhaustion threatening to pull her into the dark. Her delicate shoulders slumped, the heavy weight of the impending dawn pressing against her fragile spine. A shadow fell over the parchment. Thaddeus stepped behind her chair. Without a word, he draped a thick, exquisitely soft wolf fur blanket over her trembling shoulders, tucking the edges tightly around her to seal out the chill. His massive, calloused hands came to rest gently on her narrow shoulders. The sheer, overwhelming warmth of his touch bled straight through the heavy fur, sending a profound, grounding surge of energy directly into her hollow bones. Evangeline leaned her hat-a-day back, resting her weary neck against the solid, unyielding strength of his abdomen. She closed her eyes, releasing a long, shuddering sigh. "You must rest," Thaddeus rumbled softly, his deep baritone a vibrating comfort against her spine. His thick thumb lightly brushed the tense muscle at the base of her neck. "Your hands are shaking." "Moat, I'm running out of time," she whispered, her voice a fragile, raspy thread. "If Mott cannot find the vulnerability in the Syndicate's claim, you will lose everything." "Moat have already told you," Thaddeus murmured, leaning down so his cheek briefly brushed her soft auburn hair. "Everything Moat care about is sitting in this chair. Do not care about the deed. Moat do not care about the timber. Moat only care about the pulse in your throat." The agonizing, beautiful truth of his devotion filled her eyes capite hat fresh tears. It was a terrifying realization, how much they truly had to lose. For the first time in her life, she had a home. She had a man who looked at her as a partner, not a possession. A protector who valued her brilliant mind just as fiercely as he guarded her physical safety. The profound emotional dependence she felt was absolute. She could not imagine drawing breath in a world where he was locked in a federal prison. Mort will not lose you, Evangeline breathed fiercely, her delicate fingers reaching up to cover his heavy, scarred hand resting on her shoulder. She opened her eyes, staring down at the scattered papers, fueled by a terrifying, desperate love. Hours bled into the absolute dead of night. The oil lamp flickered, threatening to completely die. Evangeline's steel nib hovered over a heavily redacted ledger entry from 3 years prior. She cross-referenced it with the syndicate demand of collateral. Her eyes darted rapidly between the Valley Bank's original loan document and her late husband's secret master journal. A sudden, sharp gasp escaped her chapped lips. The pen clattered heavily against the wooden table. Thaddeus, dozing lightly in his leather chair by the fire, instantly opened his piercing steel blue eyes. Evangeline pushed herself up from the table, her hands violently trembling as she gripped the edges of the parchment. A brilliant, breathless disbelief washed over her pale face. "What is it?" Thaddeus demanded, immediately crossing the room, his massive frame instantly alert to danger. "He was a phantom," Evangeline whispered, her voice cracking with sheer adrenaline. She looked up at him, her hazel eyes wide and blazing with absolute triumph. "Thaddeus, Elias Vance did not borrow the syndicate's money under his own name." She pointed a shaking finger at the heavy, intricate columns of ink. "The Valley magistrate approved the federal writ based on the territorial statute of a surviving spouse," she explained rapidly, the brilliant pieces finally locking together. "But the original loan, the $3,000 the syndicate is bleeding you for, was contracted to a commercial railway holding company in the eastern states. A company that Elias legally bankrupted and dissolved 6 months before he died." Thaddeus stared at her, his brow deeply furrowed. "What does that mean for the collateral?" "It means Moat am not the collateral," Evangeline breathed, a terrifying, beautiful smile finally breaking through her exhaustion. "A widow inherits personal debt, but corporate debt dies with the dissolved entity. The Blackwood Syndicate knew they could not legally collect from a dead company, so they bribed the Valley magistrate to illegally transfer the debt to Elias's personal estate. The entire federal writ is completely, fundamentally void." A profound, staggering wave of relief crashed over the towering mountain man. The cage was broken. She had entirely outmaneuvered the most ruthless men in the territory, using nothing but a steel pen and her brilliant, unyielding mind. "We wait for the marshals," Thaddeus declared, his deep voice thick with awe. "We show them the ledger." Evangeline's victorious smile slowly, agonizingly faded. The heavy, terrifying reality of the law settled back over the room. She looked down at the parchment, her slender fingers curling into tight fists. "We cannot show the marshals," Evangeline whispered, the icy dread returning to her chest. "Marshals are executioners, not judges. They will seize the camp by force and let the courts sort out the paperwork months from now. By then, the syndicate will have burned the ledgers and buried you in a cell." Thaddeus's jaw tightened, the jagged scar pulling white. "Then, what is the path?" Evangeline looked up, meeting his piercing gaze. The absolute, undeniable terror of her past collided violently with the fierce, unyielding courage she had found on his mountain. "To void the writ permanently, these ledgers must be presented directly to the territorial judge," Evangeline stated, her voice trembling but her spine snapping entirely straight. "Before the marshals reach the ridge." Thaddeus instantly understood. The blood drained slightly from his weather-beaten face. The territorial judge resided in the central courthouse, located entirely in the heart of the valley, surrounded by the syndicate. "No," Thaddeus rumbled, a raw, immediate panic seizing his tone. Moat will not take you back down into that snake pit. You ran from them to survive. And now Mortem going back to win, Evangeline replied quietly, stepping forward to press her small, warm hand against his massive chest. We ride for the valley at dawn. The descent from the high timberline is a profound, jarring reversal of the soul. When a person climbs the mountain, they leave the chaotic, suffocating noise of the world behind, trading it for the brutal, honest silence of the ice. To go back down is to willingly ride back into the cage. Dawn broke over the jagged eastern ridge in a wash of pale, bruised lavender as Thaddeus and Evangeline rode out from the sanctuary of the lodge. The air was bitterly cold, the trail a treacherous winding ribbon of hard-packed snow. Thaddeus rode in the lead, his massive dapple gray gelding breaking the crust of the ice. He wore his heavy fur-lined canvas coat, his Winchester rifle, resting horizontally across the pommel of his saddle. His piercing steel blue eyes continuously scanned the tree line, a silent, lethal guardian fully prepared to unleash absolute violence at the first sign of a threat. Evangeline rode closely behind him, the heavy iron-bound wooden box secured tightly to her saddlebags. She was entirely engulfed in a thick, dark wool cloak borrowed from the camp stores, her pale porcelain face framed by the deep-shadowed hood. The terrifying, delicate fragility of the Valley Widow had been entirely burned away by the fires of the ridge. She sat tall, her spine perfectly straight, her hazel eyes fixed on the broad, unyielding expanse of his back, a mile above the valley floor, where the ancient blue spruces surrendered to the barren, rocky foothills. A thick, greasy layer of coal smog hung over the town like a dirty shroud. Thaddeus violently hauled his reins, bringing his massive draft horse to a halt. He waited for Evangeline to pull up beside him. The towering mountain man stared down at the distant, smog-choked settlement, a profound, agonizing dread darkening his weather-beaten face. He slowly reached across the narrow gap between their horses. His thick, heavily scarred hands gently grasped the heavy leather reins of her mount, stopping her forward momentum completely. "We can turn back," Thaddeus murmured, his deep baritone vibrating with a raw, desperate tension. He looked directly into her hazel eyes, abandoning every trace of his stoic armor. "We can ride north, over the territorial line. Mott will leave the camp. Mott will leave the timber. We can vanish into the high passes where the syndicate can never reach you." The absolute, breathtaking magnitude of his offer hung in the freezing air. He was willing to become a hunted fugitive, to surrender his kingdom, to abandon the only home he had ever known, simply to keep her by his side. Evangeline's breath hitched, a sudden, fierce rush of tears blurring her vision. She reached out from the heavy folds of her cloak, her small, gloved fingers gently covering his massive knuckles, resting over her reins. "Moat have spent my entire life running from shadows," Evangeline whispered, her voice a fragile, beautiful melody cutting through the bitter morning wind. "Mott ran from the creditors. Mott ran from the valley. Mott ran from the memory of the monsters. But Mott have finally found a sanctuary worth standing my ground for." She leaned slightly out of her saddle, her gaze dropping to the pale, jagged scar along his jawline before lifting back to his piercing steel blue eyes. "Moat never had a home until Moat woke up by your fire," she confessed. The profound, unyielding truth of her devotion completely exposed. "Moat will not let them steal the mountain from you. We walk into the dark together, Thaddeus. Or we do not walk at all." Thaddeus closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, completely absorbing the tremendous, healing warmth of her vow. When he opened them, the desperate fear was gone, replaced by the lethal, unbreakable iron of a man defending his very soul. He gave a single, firm nod. They rode down into the smog. The town was a loud, chaotic maze of muddy slush, rattling wagons and shouting merchants. The townsfolk paused on the wooden boardwalks, stopping dead in their tracks, as the towering foreman of the upper ridge rode down the main thoroughfare. Thaddeus was a terrifying, imposing figure, his massive frame radiating an aura of dark, lethal warning that caused men to instinctively pull their hats down and step backward into the alleys. They dismounted in front of the imposing brick facade of the municipal courthouse. Thaddeus unstrapped the heavy iron-bound box from her saddle, carrying the massive weight effortlessly under his uninjured arm. With his other hand, he reached out, his thick fingers securely grasping her delicate elbow. He did not lead her. He walked perfectly beside her, an immovable wall of protection as they climbed the heavy stone steps, inside the magistrate's office. The air was suffocatingly warm, thick with the smell of stale tobacco and burning coal. The stout magistrate sat behind a massive mahogany desk, a gold pocket watch ticking loudly in his vest. He looked up, his eyes widening in absolute, terrified shock as Thaddeus and Evangeline filled the doorway. Thaddeus, the magistrate stammered, frantically pushing his chair back. You have no business in the valley today. The marshals are already saddling their horses at the rail yard. Call them off, Evangeline commanded. She stepped completely out from beneath Thaddeus' towering shadow. She pushed her heavy hood back, exposing her pale porcelain face and the fierce, brilliant fire burning in her hazel eyes. She did not look at the magistrate as a beggar, nor as a destitute widow. She looked at him as an executioner reading a pardon. Thaddeus stepped forward, dropping the heavy iron lockbox directly onto the center of the mahogany desk with a deafening, resounding crash. Evangeline unlocked the box. She withdrew the heavily redacted ledgers and the Valley Bank's original loan draft, spreading them out with rapid, meticulous precision over the magistrate's blotter. The federal writ executed against the upper timberline is fundamentally void, Evangeline stated, her voice ringing out with crystal-clear, unyielding authority. She pointed a slender finger directly at the corporate seals. The syndicate claimed Elias Vance transferred his personal debt to my flesh. But this ledger proves the $3,000 was bonded to the Eastern Rail Corporation, a commercial entity that was legally dissolved. The debt is corporate, not personal. You authorized the seizure of a mountain based on a fraudulent valley claim. The magistrate's face turned a sickly, ashen gray. His trembling hands hovered over the impeccable, mathematically flawless proof of the syndicate's crime. He knew the law. He knew she was absolutely, undeniably correct. But corruption does not bow to the truth. It simply changes the shape of the blade. The magistrate slowly sat back in his leather chair, a dark, nervous sweat beading on his forehead. He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a fresh, heavily stamped piece of vellum. You possess a brilliant mind, Mrs. Vance, the magistrate muttered, wiping his brow with a silk handkerchief. And if you presented these ledgers to the territorial judge in the capital, he would undoubtedly rule in your favor. Pass, eventually. The stout man leaned forward, his voice dropping into a cruel, calculated whisper. But the capital is a 3-week journey by rail. The federal marshals are 3 blocks away, and Thaddeus here has already committed a federal offense. He harbored a wanted fugitive, and he threatened a deputized bounty hunter with a rifle, but cannot stop the marshals from executing an arrest warrant for a federal assault. Thaddeus' jaw clenched, the heavy muscles in his massive shoulders tensing for violence. He took a single, terrifying step toward the desk, but Evangeline threw her arm across his chest, desperately holding him back. What do you want? Evangeline breathed, the icy dread completely returning to her hollow bones. The magistrate slid the fresh piece of vellum across the desk. It was an indentured labor contract. The syndicate wants their pound of flesh, the magistrate stated coldly. Sign this voluntary surrender. 10 years of labor in the eastern textile factories to clear the corporate deficit. If you sign this contract, the syndicate withdraws all complaints. The writ is cancelled. Thaddeus walks out of this office entirely free, and his deed is restored. Evangeline stared at the heavy black ink. the phantom chains of the valley finally wrapping securely around her fragile throat. "And if Mort refuse," she whispered, her voice trembling. "If you refuse." "The marshals arrest Thaddeus right now," the magistrate replied, pulling his pocket watch from his vest. "He will rot in a federal penitentiary for 10 years while the territorial court slowly untangles your beautiful ledgers. And the mountain will be seized as evidence." The magistrate snapped the gold watch shut. "The marshals ride at dawn tomorrow. You have until the sun clears the ridge to return to this office and sign the contract, Mrs. Vance. Or the mountain man burns." The cramped, squalid boarding house room in the valley was a suffocating wooden box. It smelled heavily of stale ale, damp rot, and the oppressive greasy coal smog that choked the town. The thin walls offered no defense against the chaotic, drunken shouting from the saloon across the muddy street. It was a brutal, jarring contrast to the pristine, silent sanctuary of the high timberline, a grim reminder that they had descended directly into the jaws of the wolves. Thaddeus stood by the single, grimy window, peering through a tear in the moth-eaten curtain. The dim flickering glow of the street lamps illuminated the deep, terrifying tension in his massive frame. His thick fingers moved hot, dark, lethal efficiency, loading heavy brass cartridges into the magazine of his Winchester rifle. The metallic clack of the action echoing in the small room sounded like a death knell. Evangeline sat perfectly still on the edge of the narrow, sagging mattress, her hazel eyes tracking his every movement. "There are 2 deputies stationed at the end of the alley," Thaddeus rumbled, his deep baritone vibrating with a low, dangerous frequency. He did not look back at her, his piercing steel blue eyes remaining fixed on the street. "When the town drunkards finally pass out, the street will clear. We leave at midnight. We will take the horses through the old mining trail behind the rail yard. The marshals will not expect us to head east." Evangeline looked at the heavy, dark blood seeping faintly through the fresh linen bandage on his left bicep. The grueling ride down the mountain had reopened the terrible wound. His weather-beaten face was drawn, his skin carrying a terrifying, exhausted pallor. He had fought an apocalyptic blizzard, carried her through waist-deep snow, bled for her, and traded his entire kingdom for her breath. And now, he was preparing to die for her. Her brilliant, analytical mind had already calculated the brutal mathematics of their reality. The eastern mining trail was a dead end, blocked by the winter drifts. The town was crawling with syndicate men. If Thaddeus stepped out of this boarding house with a loaded rifle, he would not be fighting 2 deputies. He would be fighting an army of deputized gunslingers. The federal government would slaughter him in the mud, burn the beautiful timber camp on the high ridge to ashes, and drag her away to the factories in chains. The magistrate's cruel ultimatum echoed in the suffocating air. "Sign the contract, or the mountain man burns." Thaddeus finally turned away from the window. He leaned the heavy rifle against the rotting wall and walked heavily toward the bed. The floorboards groaned in protest under his immense weight. He stopped directly in front of her, the sheer, towering mass of his body blocking out the ugly, smog-choked light of the valley. He saw the terrifying, icy despair pooling in her hazel eyes, misunderstanding her silence for fear of the escape. Thaddeus reached down, his massive, calloused hands gently grasping her delicate shoulders. "Look at me," Thaddeus commanded softly, entirely abandoning the lethal guardian to become her quiet, absolute sanctuary once more. Evangeline tilted her chin up, her breath hitching as she met his gaze. With exquisite, agonizing gentleness, Thaddeus lowered himself, dropping to one knee on the filthy floorboards, so he was perfectly level with her. He unfastened his massive, fur-lined canvas coat and draped it heavily over her shivering shoulders, recreating the profound, grounding warmth he had offered her in the town clinic weeks ago. "You are not going to a factory," Thaddeus murmured, his thick thumb rising to lightly brush the pale curve of her cheekbone. "Elias Vance is dead. His debts are dead. Mort will tear this entire valley down to the bedrock before I let them place a chain on your wrist. Do you understand me? We are going home." A profound, shattering wave of agony crashed through her hollow bones. He was the most honorable, deeply good man she had ever known. He loved her with a terrifying, unyielding devotion that demanded nothing and offered everything. But true love was not merely clinging to someone to survive the storm. True love was the terrifying, devastating choice to stand in the fire so the other person would not burn. The fragile, now broken widow, who had arrived on the stagecoach, would have clung to his coat and let him fight. But the iron-willed woman forged in the high peaks knew exactly what she had to do. "Won't understand," Evangeline breathed. Her voice a flawless, beautiful lie. She reached her small, trembling hands out from beneath the heavy canvas coat. She cupped his rugged, weather-beaten face, her delicate thumbs tracing the pale, jagged scar along his jawline. She memorized the rough texture of his beard, the sharp, strong angle of his cheek, and the bottomless, fierce protection in his steel blue eyes. "You are bleeding again," she whispered, her heart physically aching against her ribs. "The midnight bell is hours away. Lie down, Thaddeus. Close your eyes for just an hour. Let the bleeding stop. Moat will wake you when the street is clear." Thaddeus hesitated. The deep, instinctual paranoia of the hunted man fighting against the sheer, overwhelming exhaustion dragging at his blood-starved muscles. "Lie down," Evangeline pleaded gently, leaning forward to press her warm, soft forehead directly against his. "Please. For me." The absolute trust he held for her completely shattered his resistance. Thaddeus gave a single, heavy nod. He slowly pushed himself up from the floor, his immense frame swaying slightly from the blood loss. He lay down on the narrow, sagging mattress, completely dwarfing the small bed. He kept his uninjured right hand resting over the grip of the heavy revolver, tucked into his belt, entirely prepared to wake at the slightest sound of danger. Evangeline pulled a thin wool blanket over his massive shoulders. She sat in the wooden chair beside the bed, watching the slow, rhythmic rise and fall of his chest, het within Thaddeus. The brutal, punishing toll of the past 3 days finally claimed him. The sheer exhaustion pulled the towering mountain man into a deep, heavy slumber. The boarding house room fell completely silent, save for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the downstairs hall. Evangeline sat perfectly still, completely paralyzed by the agonizing, devastating weight of the choice she was making. She was abandoning the only true home she had ever known. She was deliberately walking back into the suffocating, terrifying cage of the syndicate. 10 years of brutal factory labor awaited her in the eastern states. 10 years of inhaling smog, of aching bones, of paying for a phantom crimes. But as she looked at Thaddeus' peaceful, sleeping face, a profound, unshakable peace settled over her trembling soul. He would keep the mountain. He would keep his sanctuary. The federal marshals would withdraw their warrants, and he would wake up a free man. She was trading her life for his, balancing the ultimate ledger of the heart. The clock downstairs chimed 4 heavy, mournful notes. Dawn was approaching. Evangeline stood up, her movements completely silent. She removed the heavy, fur-lined canvas coat, folding it with painstaking, meticulous care, and draped it over the back of the wooden chair. She could not take it with her. She belonged to the valley now. The coat belonged to the high ridge. She walked to the edge of the bed. She reached down, her delicate fingers brushing one final, agonizingly light touch across his thick, dark hair. A single, hot tear escaped her lashes, splashing silently onto the collar of his red flannel shirt. "Won't love you," Evangeline whispered into the dark. A raw, devastating confession meant only for the shadows. "Forgive me." She unwrapped the frayed, dark charcoal mourning shawl from her narrow shoulders. She smoothed the heavy wool fabric out, folding it into a perfect, neat square. With trembling hands, she laid the dark shawl gently onto the pillow beside his head, a silent, final surrender. She picked up the heavy, iron-bound wooden box containing her late husband as ledgers. She did not look back. She slipped through the rickety wooden door, stepping out into the freezing, smog-choked nightmare of the valley, walking alone toward the magistrate's office to sign her life away. 2 hours later, the bitter morning sun broke over the jagged eastern ridge, casting long, blinding rays of light through the grimy window of the boarding house. Thaddeus inhaled sharply, his piercing steel blue eyes snapping open. The ambient noise of the street had changed. The drunks were gone, replaced by the heavy, terrifying clatter of cavalry horses and the jingle of federal marshal spurs gathering at the end of the block. He bolted upright, entirely ignoring the sharp, tearing pain in his shoulder. He reached out with his massive left hand, expecting to find Evangeline sitting in the chair, ready to run. His hand grasped empty air. "Evangeline," Thaddeus rumbled, his deep voice thick with sleep. He frantically scanned the cramped room. The heavy iron lockbox was gone. The heavy canvas coat was draped over the chair. His piercing gaze snapped back to the bed. Resting perfectly centered on the empty pillow beside him was the dark charcoal morning shawl. Thaddeus stared at the folded black fabric. A sudden, paralyzing spike of absolute terror driving entirely through his chest. The devastating, catastrophic realization hit him with the force of an avalanche. The midnight hour had long passed. She had not woken him. She had lied to him. The fragile doll had not run away from the monsters. She had walked directly into their jaws to buy his freedom. Thaddeus gripped the dark shawl in his massive, trembling fist, letting out a raw, devastating roar of pure agony that shook the very foundations of the valley boarding house. A man who has lost everything once will not quietly endure losing it a second time. The wrath of the mountain descended upon the valley, not with a howling squall, but with the terrifying, silent momentum of a towering, heavily scarred timber foreman carrying a loaded Winchester. Thaddeus did not walk down the muddy thoroughfare. He tore through it. The heavy, dark charcoal morning shawl was tucked securely against his chest, right over his violently beating heart. The federal marshals gathering near the rail yard turned, their hands instinctively dropping to their holsters as the massive, unyielding shadow completely eclipsed the morning sun. Thaddeus ignored them entirely. He reached the heavy mahogany doors of the municipal courthouse. He did not knock. He did not ask for permission. He raised his heavy leather work boot and drove it directly into the center of the double doors. The brass locks violently shattered. The heavy wood splintered inward capite hot, a deafening crash, bouncing off the interior walls of the magistrate's office. Thaddeus stepped through the ruin, the cold steel barrel of the rifle raised, his piercing steel blue eyes blazing with an absolute, apocalyptic fury. He fully expected to find Evangeline in iron cuffs, weeping as her delicate hand was forced to sign the brutal indenture contract. He was entirely prepared to burn the building to the bedrock, to pull her from the ashes. Instead, the towering mountain man froze entirely in his tracks. Evangeline was not in chains. She was not weeping. She stood perfectly upright in the absolute center of the room, her spine as unyielding as the ancient blue spruces of the high ridge. The heavy dark wool cloak was pushed back, revealing her pale porcelain face, which carried no trace of the fragile, hunted valley widow. She radiated the terrifying, brilliant authority of a queen holding court. The stout magistrate was slumped in his heavy leather chair, his face a sickening, ashen gray, entirely coated in a thick panicked sweat. Standing near the window, his pristine velvet-collared coat, looking suddenly absurd, was Mercer. The syndicate's ruthless bounty hunter was gripping his silver-tipped walking sticks so tightly his knuckles were completely white. his dark eyes, burning with helpless, cornered rage. Resting on the magistrate's desk was the heavy, iron-bound wooden box, completely empty. "Lower the rifle." "Thaddeus," Evangeline commanded softly. Her voice carried no fear, only a profound, grounding warmth that instantly anchored his frantic soul. Thaddeus did not lower the weapon. He kept his lethal gaze locked on Mercer. "Step away from her." "He cannot touch me," Evangeline murmured, stepping directly into his line of sight, forcing his piercing eyes to meet her hazel ones. A brilliant, triumphant smile touched her chapped lips. "There is no debt, Thaddeus. There is no warrant. The cage is entirely broken." Thaddeus blinked, the sheer adrenaline slowly draining from his blood-starved muscles. He looked from her radiant face to the defeated, trembling magistrate. "What did you do?" Mercer let out a sharp, venomous hiss, abandoning his arrogant drawl entirely. "She played the federal wires." The fragile little valley doll waited until the telegraph office opened at Motvif dawn and transmitted the entirety of her husband's master ledgers directly to the territorial judge in the capital. Moat did not come down the mountain to sign a surrender, Evangeline clarified, her voice ringing with crystal-clear victory. She turned slightly to look at the magistrate with absolute, withering disdain. Elias Vance created a phantom corporation to steal that gold. The Blackwood Syndicate knew the debt was uncollectible, so they bribed this magistrate to illegally bind a corporate deficit to a living widow. She reached out, her delicate fingers resting proudly against Thaddeus' massive, flannel-clad arm. By filing the master ledgers with the capital, the debt was legally and permanently transferred to the voided corporate account, Evangeline explained. The magnificent trap finally springing shut. The territorial judge immediately wired a federal injunction back to the rail yard. The marshals outside are no longer here to execute a writ against the timberline. They are here to investigate the Blackwood Syndicate for federal banking fraud. The absolute, staggering brilliance of her maneuver hit Thaddeus with the force of a physical blow. She had not walked into the valley to sacrifice herself. She had walked into the valley to completely, fundamentally dismantle the monsters using the very laws they had corrupted. She had used the contents of her darkest, most agonizing secret, the iron-bound box, to build an impenetrable fortress around his kingdom. The magistrate frantically mopped his brow, his trembling hands pushing a piece of heavy vellum across the desk. "It was the master deed to the upper timberline. The deed is restored to the foreman," the magistrate stammered, his eyes darting terrified toward the shattered doors where the marshals were now gathering. "The federal warrants for assault are withdrawn. The syndicate has no further claim in this valley," Mercer sneered, violently adjusting his pristine bowler hat. He looked at Evangeline. A twisted, grudging respect buried beneath his fury. "You burned the bridge, Mrs. Vance. But the fire will eventually reach the other side. If you ever cast a shadow on our mountain again," Thaddeus rumbled, his deep baritone vibrating with a dark, terrifying promise, "Moat will not give you the mercy of a courtroom. Walk out of this valley, hound." "Before I change my mind." Mercer did not test the threat. He tipped his hat one final, bitter time, and slipped out the back door in the smog-choked alley, fleeing the federal marshals waiting out front. The heavy, suffocating tension entirely evaporated from the ruined office. The magistrate buried his face in his hands, waiting for the federal men to place him in irons. Thaddeus slowly lowered the heavy Winchester rifle, letting the butt of the stock rest against the floorboards. The deafening, chaotic noise of the valley completely faded away. There was only her. Evangeline took a slow step toward him. The brilliant, analytical warrior melted away, leaving only the woman who loved him with an absolute, terrifying devotion. She looked up at his massive, towering frame, her hazel eyes completely overflowing with tears of profound, agonizing relief. "Mort told you," she whispered, her delicate hands reaching out to grasp the worn red flannel of his shirt. "Mort will not be your ruin." Thaddeus let the heavy rifle clatter to the floor. The stoic, impenetrable fortress of the mountain man completely collapsed. He reached into his coat, pulling the folded, dark charcoal morning shawl from his chest, and gently pressed it into her hands. Then, his massive, calloused arms wrapped entirely around her fragile waist, pulling her flush against his broad chest. He buried his face into her soft auburn hair, breathing in the scent of her, his immense shoulders shaking with a raw, overwhelming emotional catharsis. He had spent his life terrified of his own strength, believing his massive hands could only fail to hold the things he loved. But the fragile doll had never needed his physical strength to save her. She had possessed the iron all along. They had simply needed each other to realize it. There is a quiet, profound magic in the shifting of the seasons on the high ridge. When the bitter winter finally surrenders, the mountain does not hold on to the frost. The heavy, crushing snowpack melts into brilliantly clear, rushing streams. The ancient blue spruces shake off their icy armor, and the barren granite cliffs explode with the vibrant, breathtaking colors of wild alpine fireweed. Months later, the main lodge of the upper timberline stood with its heavy spruce doors, thrown completely open to the warm, golden afternoon sun. The violent, deafening roar of the blizzards had been replaced by the rhythmic, honest thud of axes on the distant treeline, and the gentle whistling of the mountain wind. The heavy leather chair by the central hearth no longer belonged to a solitary, haunted ghost. Thaddeus stood by the massive oak table, his thick, calloused fingers resting gently against the open pages of the camp ledger. The pale, jagged scar along his jawline was no longer a symbol of agonizing grief. It was simply a mark of the terrain, a testament to the man who had survived the avalanche and finally found the sun. The deep, solitary silence in his piercing steel-blue eyes had been entirely replaced by a profound, radiant peace. He turned his head as soft footsteps approached over the floorboards. Evangeline walked into the warm, sunlit room. She wore no dark charcoal morning clothes. She was dressed in a simple, sturdy dress of deep forest green, entirely suited for the beautiful, rugged life of the ridge. The heavy, oversized, fur-lined canvas coat was draped lovingly over her slender shoulders, not out of necessity against the cold, but simply because she loved the grounding, cedary scent of him wrapped around her. She carried a tin cup of steaming black coffee, offering it to him with a brilliant, breathtaking smile that reached entirely into her bright hazel eyes. "The southern slope is completely cleared," she murmured, stepping naturally into the protective, sheltering space beneath his arm. "The books are balanced. The camp is secure." Thaddeus accepted the tin cup, setting it down so he could wrap his massive right arm entirely around her waist. He pulled her flush against his side, his thumb lightly, reverently brushing the soft curve of her hip. He looked out through the open doors, looking past the timber sleds, past the majestic, towering pines, straight out into the endless, beautiful expanse of the horizon they now owned together. "The camp has always been secure since the day you claimed that ledger," Thaddeus rumbled, his deep baritone vibrating with absolute, unyielding devotion. He leaned down, pressing a slow, profoundly tender kiss to her warm forehead. "You hold the sky up, Evangeline." She rested her cheek against his broad, solid chest, listening to the steady, powerful rhythm of the heartbeat that belonged entirely to her. They were two fractured souls who had collided in the freezing dark, one carrying the crushing weight of the past, the other hunted by the shadows of a phantom. But out here, where the air was thin and the truth was absolute, they had forged something unbreakable. The mountain man had found his heart, and the fragile doll had found her iron. And as the warm hearth fire crackled softly behind them, casting a golden glow over the empty, unlocked wooden box in the corner. They knew they would never have to run from the winter again.